For a period of time, I was living all by myself in a house that my parents owned. There had been more homes when they'd first bought the place, but due to constant flooding in the area, a lot of the houses had been purchased by FEMA and then torn down. After that, lots of trees and shrubs and foliage grew in their place. The area then had very few houses anymore. However, they did have a lot of forested area now. My parents eventually moved out of state, but I stayed in the house for my last year of college, mostly because I could stay there for free now. Unfortunately for me, however, during that very same fall, my car suddenly stopped working. My university was in the city, and generally it took about an hour to drive there. This meant I'd have to find a new way to get to and from school. Luckily, there was a train station in the area, but it was at least an hour-and-a-half walk away from the house. I didn't have a bicycle or anything like that either. That meant I had to walk there in the morning and walk back from there in the evening, just in order to attend school. On one particular Tuesday, I had a late class. It was around 11 p.m. by the time I got off the train and began my long walk home. Not only that, but it had also begun lightly snowing while I was riding on the train. This meant there was a fresh covering of snow on the ground while I was making my hour-and-a-half trek to get home. It was so dark by the time I got to my neighborhood. As I previously mentioned, it was a fairly old neighborhood, so there weren't any lights other than the porch lights some houses had on. At least I knew once I got in that area, it would only be a few more minutes until I was in the warmth and safety of my house. The snow on the ground is important to know about. If you know that scrunching sound that it makes when you walk on it, that was of course the sound I was hearing while I was walking. At one point though, when I was walking down the darkest part of the neighborhood, I began to hear that very same scrunching from behind me. I was about to turn around and see if someone was behind me, but before I could, I heard a voice call out from the darkness. "Don't you dare turn around, or I'll kill you." I didn't know what to do. Of course, I decided not to turn around in that moment. I mean, I don't know if I believed the guy was going to kill me or not, but I was shocked and scared enough to not try and test him. "Keep walking," the voice instructed me. When I did, I heard the snow-scrunching noises now coming from both of us. We were on the street that my house was on. There happened to be no other homes on that street either. It was very, very dark, and I was extremely terrified. I didn't recognize this voice, and I didn't know why he was walking behind me. I didn't know if he was serious about hurting me, or even if he had the ability to do so. It was a short walk through that dark street, but it was also the longest walk of my life. Something then happened that I still can't explain to this day. I could have sworn that at some point I'd stopped hearing the scrunching in the snow behind me. I was now right in front of my house, so there was a little bit of light now. I turned around and was completely shocked when I saw there was no one walking behind me at all. There wasn't a lot of light outside, of course, and it was very, very dark looking down that street. Someone could have been standing further down and I wouldn't have noticed them, or perhaps they'd slipped off into the woods. I really had no idea. The one thing I did know now, however, is that whoever had been following me had stopped at some point for some reason, regardless of how they'd done so. I didn't waste any time after that. I turned and sprinted up the driveway, ran into the house, and locked myself inside. My parents had left a gun in the closet of the bedroom that had previously been theirs, so I went and retrieved it. Sometimes, when I tell this story to people, they ask me why I didn't just call the police. What would I have told them? I heard a voice threaten me from behind. I didn't know who it was, where they'd went off to, or anything really. Thankfully, I also never had another experience like that again. I do have to tell you, however, that for a while, walking home from school that late at night was completely terrifying. I kept on wondering if something was going to come out of the darkness again. Eventually, I did get over it, but thinking about it now still freaks me out a bit. When I went to elementary school, we had to walk to school. It was about a half-hour walk across the neighborhood, which was fenced in. Then it was across the road, which had a crossing guard, and then down the street to the school. Normally, since all the kids in the neighborhood went to school this way, there were always tons of kids of all ages walking to and from school at the same time. I was in the 3rd grade at the time this happened. Now, I don't really remember why, but for some reason I had to stay after school one day. I do remember it was a particularly dreary day as well. I was after school for quite a while. When I began to walk home, this meant there weren't many other kids about. In fact, there weren't even any kids out playing because of how dreary the weather was. I'd gotten through the crosswalk just fine. The guard wasn't there anymore, but it did at least have walking lights, so I used those instead. I crossed the street after and then was back into my neighborhood. As I was walking on the sidewalk down the street, a car pulled up right next to me. I could see there was a man in the driver's seat who rolled his window down and began to call out to me. I stopped to see what he needed. "Pretty nasty looking day out there, huh, kid?" he asked me. "Yeah, I hope I don't get rained on." "Well, how about you just jump in the car here and I'll give you a swift ride home," he offered. "That way you won't have to worry about the rain at all." This happened back in the 1970s, so there wasn't as much attention given to not going off with strangers back then. I knew I shouldn't get in the car technically, but I was stuck in a hard place now. I was always taught to be overly polite as a kid, so I didn't really learn how to turn down offers, and because of that I was actually considering accepting it. As I began to move toward the car, something happened though. A lady came sprinting out of her home and toward me. When the guy driving the car noticed her approaching, he began to swiftly roll up his window and slammed on the gas to drive away. I was very confused in the moment, but the lady was extremely nice. She didn't even know me, but she offered to walk me home herself. She didn't explain why to me, but being such a young kid and the whole thing being so bizarre, I thought it might be a good idea to not go by myself now. Apparently, as I'd later found out, there had been some child abductions in my neighborhood. There was a watch going on, and that lady was part of the neighborhood watch. She'd noticed what was going on, and feared an attempted abduction was going on right then. I can't say with 100% proof that the guy was actually trying to abduct me, but it's scary thinking about what might have happened if I had gotten into that car. I'm very grateful to that lady that had been watching from her house that day. This won't be a particularly long story, but I had a really freaky experience once when I was camping. This was when I was at a summer camp actually. Although we spent most of the time in camp and sleeping in cabins, there were a few days when some of the older campers, which I was one of, would go out on a hiking trip. Then we had to put up tents and sleep in those. Wasn't exactly one of my favorite things to do. Sleeping in a canvas tent in a sleeping bag on the cold ground was something I never understood why people enjoyed. I did though pretty much like everything else about that summer camp. I was 14 years old when this event happened. I was on the second night of a hiking trip. It was when we'd gotten as far from the camp as we could before circling back on our way back. There wasn't a lot that we knew about the area, except that it was owned by the camp. Beyond that area, there were all sorts of weird summer camp stories about who lurked that far out into the woods. On that night, I was laying in my tent. I was having a really hard time falling asleep for some reason. As I was laying there in my bag, I could hear a really weird sound coming from outside. It was like some sort of rattling noise. I knew it couldn't have been a snake or something though, because we didn't have them in that area of the country. It was just really strange and kind of out of place. My tent did have a little screen on the side of it. I looked out of it, in the direction that I'd heard the noise coming from, only to see the strangest thing. At first, I couldn't see anything, but after I observed a bit longer, it looked like there was someone standing off in the trees, looking in the direction of the camp. They were making some weird movements, almost like they were doing some sort of ritual dance or something. I suppose the rattling sound was happening because he was shaking something in his hands. One of the counselors must have been awake and noticed it too. I saw him get out of his tent and shine his flashlight over at the figure. I'd only gotten a quick look at the person before they turned and ran off into the woods after being noticed. The only thing I really took note of was that he was wearing a black mask over his face. It was at that point I rushed out of my tent and over to the counselor, Steve, and asked him if he knew who that person was. Steve seemed a little bit shaken up. I told him I'd seen the guy too, and asked if he knew this person. For a moment, I thought perhaps it might have been a prank or something like that. I could see, though, that Steve was so genuinely upset by seeing that guy that it couldn't possibly be. We talked about it quite a bit. Steve was convinced it was some sort of hoodoo man or witch doctor. I guess that's what bothered him. At the same time, I suppose the idea bothered me, too. I did go to that camp for years after that encounter, and never heard the rattle nor saw the weird man from the woods again. I suppose that's really a good thing, though. I really didn't share my dating life with my parents when I was a teenager. I thought they either wouldn't be accepting or they would keep on trying to pry into my life. Honestly, if I'd offered to share it with them, I doubt they would have been interested very much, though. My parents were very absent a lot of the time. They paid more attention to my little sister than they ever did to me. I was okay with that, though. I liked that I was mostly to myself. I would go out and meet people and not really bring them home. I've had more dates just walking around than I could let anyone know. When I was 17, I met up with this guy in the city. Personally, I lived in the suburbs, but he sounded like a pretty cool guy, so we decided to meet up there. We had a nice little dinner at a diner. I don't always like to put the cart before the horse, but I figured that everything had gone so well, we probably had a nice shot at having another date. After the dinner, I offered to walk him back to his place, but he suggested we go for a walk in the park instead. It was a fairly cool night, and I liked that sort of weather. It seemed kind of romantic to me. We went for a slow, leisurely walk through the park. After a while, we started to walk off the trail. We came to a point where there was a nice big tree surrounded by fallen leaves. We sat down and continued to talk. All in all, it was one of the most pleasant nights I can remember. When we got up to walk, we made it back onto the path. We must have lost track of time, though, while we were together, because it was much later than either of us had planned to stay out. Finally, we decided I would walk him back to his place before I went home on my own. There weren't many people out this late, but there was one guy we'd walked by who was walking off to the side talking on his cell phone. We didn't really think that much about it, but then, not a few moments later after we had passed him by, he turned around and began to walk in the same direction as we were. While we were walking, the man started talking louder as well, almost as if he wanted us to hear him. We tried to ignore, but he kept on talking so loudly that it was almost impossible. He was talking about some really disturbing things, too. Talking about some dead body he had to bury or something. He was going on, talking about different ways of killing people. He had mentioned dismembering and using lime or something like that. We didn't really want to take it seriously, assuming this guy must just be some douchebag or something. Surely he was just trying to scare us. I do hate to admit that it was actually getting to us, though. Mostly because it seemed he was deliberately following us now. Then we heard him say this. No, I haven't killed anyone yet. I was just wondering, in a hypothetical scenario, how one would dispose of a body or two, if they had one. It was weird that he was doing this, but we felt a bit better thinking he must be scaring us or something. That was until he said, "Well, you see, I'm following these two guys in the park right now, and I'm thinking about doing something." Needless to say, that scared us. We ran until we got out of the park. Once we were out, we turned around and looked. We didn't see anyone behind us. We were shaken, but very thankful. Maybe in the end the guy really was just playing a prank or something, but in the moment it was very terrifying. I was driving a shortcut from 29 Palms, California, to Albuquerque, New Mexico. And 29 Palms is located in the desolate high desert east of Los Angeles. The shortcut was an all two-lane road through total nothingness, except for passing through Amboy, California. Amboy is a nearly abandoned town anyway, as far below sea level as Death Valley. It also has a dormant volcano and lava field on one side, and a salt flat on the other. This meant at the time it was fairly deserted, and also rumored to be a hotspot for satanic group activity. I was driving by myself in the afternoon. I'd stopped by in Amboy and snapped a picture of the city sign, just to prove I was there to friends who had dared me to take that route to I-40. I hopped back in my car and proceeded to start driving up the mountain range between Amboy and I-40. Once I reached the top, I was driving north through a canyon with high grass on both sides of the road. Just up ahead, I could make out some things scattered across the middle of the road. As I approached, I started to slow down, only to see a red Pontiac Fiero stopped sideways across both lanes. There was a suitcase open with clothes scattered about everywhere, and two bodies laying face down in the road. It seemed to be a man and a woman. I stopped 100 or so feet away, and the hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. Being a veteran, I reached under my seat and pulled out a pistol and chambered around. Something seemed very wrong here. It looked way too perfect, as if it had just been staged. An ambush, perhaps. Was I being paranoid? I could just tell something was wrong. Of course, getting out of the car now seemed unthinkable. It was the horror movie move. As I scanned the road, I saw a line I could drive by. I passed the guy in the road on his left and swerved to the right side of the woman, just behind the Fiero. Now I was on the other side. I drove the line just as planned. I passed the back of the Fiero without hitting it or either of the bodies in the road, and continued forward for a couple of 100 feet. I slowed down so I could breathe a bit and let my heart reset its pace. Only, as I looked up into the rear-view mirror, I could see those two bodies had gotten up to their knees, and 20 or so people had emerged from the tall grass on either side of the road by the car and bodies. At that moment, my right foot smashed the gas pedal to the floor, and I did not let up until I had to slow down for the I-40 East on-ramp. I'll never know what would have happened to me had I gotten out of the car to check on those bodies, or stopped my car just a bit closer to them. Somehow, I'm quite sure it would not have been a good outcome. Sometimes real life can be much scarier than a movie. I used to work at a security company with a bunch of my friends. We all got along pretty well, and most of us even hung out outside of work. The ones I didn't hang out with mostly kept to themselves. There were these two brothers that worked nights with me, and they were part of their own group. They were new to the company and would have many conversations about their guns. Bill was the older brother, and Luke was the younger. After hearing Luke and Bill talk about target shooting so much, I started to develop a bit of an interest. I didn't own a single firearm, but my roommate owned several. I mentioned at work one night that I was going shooting in the morning with my roommate, and I needed a good place to go to. Well, the two brothers pointed out a spot on Google Earth that seemed perfect to me, said it was great, and they'd shot up there many times before. It was 45 minutes away and a bit higher up in the mountains. I knew the spot precisely due to a single image posted to the coordinates on Google Earth with the used shotgun shells covering the ground. I decided that was as good a spot as any and told my roommate Dawn where to go. We arrived the next morning at 10 a.m. and parked at the top of the hill. We saw our spot about 150 yards away in a clearing down in the valley and began to hike down. On a quick side note, I wear this very bright neon yellow hooded sweatshirt at work and during the winter. I'm also a fairly large fella. Being so big and brightly colored made me very visible from very far away. I've seen hunters using bright colors to avoid accidentally getting shot by other hunters, and I decided to wear my trademark bright hoodie on our little hike just in case. We'd made it about a quarter of the way down the hill when I saw a group of fellow target shooters at our desired spot. These were the only other people we had seen in 30 minutes. It seems the spot is taken. That's lame, I said. The second I said lame, that's when shit hit the fan. We were on the side of a mountain, walking down towards them, when all of a sudden the rounds just started flying. This group was now shooting at us. Dawn and I were the targets for about 3 guns, and we didn't have any cover. I could see Dawn running across the mountain, and I saw what he was running for, a small plateau about 20 yards next to us. That sound of the bullets just barely whizzing by inches away from my head is a sound I'll never forget. Movies don't do the sound justice at all, not even close. I still get chills just thinking about it now. The vibration in the air of the bullets chilled my bones. It made everything go slow motion, and it felt crystal clear. My adrenaline was kicking in. We made it to cover and hit dirt. We were pinned down, but at least we had cover now. I could hear what sounded like hundreds of rounds passing just over the lip of the plateau. A pistol, a rifle, a shotgun. I heard them all. The trees and boulders and the mountainside were being hammered by round after round. If we'd have stood up from that cover, I was sure I'd have been shot right in the face. These people were shooting uphill towards a road. They had their backs to their paper targets. Thinking back on it, my father said I should have yelled down to them to let them know they were shooting at 2 people and to hold their fire. The thing is, I'm pretty sure they knew exactly what they were shooting at. How could they not? We weren't that far away, and the mountainside was almost completely bare. I didn't want to let them know how close they were to killing us. I should have shot back. We had the high ground, but I didn't want to be a killer. We waited and listened for their footsteps, and wanted them to stay where they were. If we were killed, no one would ever find our bodies out here. 15 minutes went by, and the gunfire just did not let up, until suddenly it just ended. The mountain was completely quiet again. After 5 minutes of silence, we checked down the hill. They were gone. We had our guns at the ready as we scanned the valley down below. Nothing. No more guys, no vehicle, just all of their expended rounds left behind. We decided this was a great time to get the hell out of here. We made it back to our car and back to our house faster than ever. When I went back to work the next shift, I told this story to everyone. I even thanked Bill for the sweet advice. He apologized for the bad locals and said that was just insane. Another coworker told me, though, that Bill and Luke had gone out shooting the same morning as I did, in the same area. I asked Bill about it immediately, asked him when he'd gone shooting and what guns he had brought. He pointed at the exact same image as before. Luke, his friend, and Bill were using a Glock, a .22 rifle, and a 12-gauge shotgun. It was all coming together. I told him he was insane, and he'd almost killed us. He denied shooting at us, even changed his mind about where they were shooting after a bit of questioning. He said he was actually 2 miles west because his GPS was inaccurate. I knew he was lying, but again, what could I do? I had no proof. What was I gonna do, just shoot him in revenge? He worked with me for another 2 years, before I moved away and never heard from them again. I remember how emotionless he was when he denied shooting at me. It was like he was a robot. We never spoke of it after the first time, and I've never gone shooting since. Why is it that when winter rolls around, it always seems to bring out the freaks, you know? I really hate it. When I was a senior in high school, I was a pizza delivery guy in a college town. For the most part, during winter break, business was really slow. During my second year delivering pizzas, though, I had the worst delivery experience ever. That night, I just so happened to be the only driver who was working. Well, on second thought, I guess maybe it wasn't quite that unusual. Most of the other drivers were college kids who would go home for breaks, so they wouldn't be around anyway. I was at work, bored off my ass, because there'd only been a few orders all day. Whilst I was hanging out and talking with the cashier, I actually became very grateful for this, because a snowstorm was just starting to brew up. She was a very cute girl, and I'd been trying to put the moves on her for a while. Each time I'd come up short, though. I'd like to think I was making at least some progress when we got an order for a pizza finally. For many reasons, I was not happy about having to drive through pitch darkness in a snowstorm. It was really hard to see for one, and for two, I had to drive extremely slow. It was no surprise to me then that the pizza was to be delivered to a house far outside of town, mostly since there were no students on campus at this time. Even the trek to the house itself was slippery and dangerous. Luckily, I made it there just fine. It seemed to be an older two-story house, with nothing very unusual about it. I pulled my car into the slippery driveway. I was a bit apprehensive at first. There seemed to be no lights on at all. I double-checked my GPS. Definitely the right house, though. I gathered up the pizza and the cookie pizza for dessert and hopped out of my car. I walked up the steps to the front porch, nearly slipping along the way. Just as I hit the second step, the porch light shot on, startling me with the suddenness. When I made it to the screen door, the regular door opened. A lady who looked to be in her 50s or so opened the door. She immediately looked alarmed and opened the screen door as well. "What are you doing here? Get in the house right now!" I wasn't about to go into a stranger's house. I have your pizza," I stammered in confusion, suddenly even more unhappy about this assignment. "I didn't order a damn pizza. I can't fucking believe this is happening. Get in here right now or you're gonna get killed." "Why?" I asked, confused and now more than a little bit scared. The woman hurried me into the house, and I went along with her. Once I was behind her and inside, she locked the door shut and bolted it several times. "What the hell is going on?" I asked. "Keep your voice down," the lady told me. "There's a guy outside who's been tormenting me and trying to get into my house. He cut my phone line and I haven't been able to call the police. He's been trying to get in and I've been terrified. He must have called for you to get me to open the door. He probably thought I couldn't just leave you out there to get killed." I thought the woman must be crazy, but then I started to hear noises. I looked over to the window by the porch, and what I saw made my blood run cold immediately. I could see a crazed-looking man on the porch right by the window, peeking in, tapping what looked to be the tip of a chef's knife against the glass. I had no idea how he could have gotten there so fast. Then I realized he must have been hiding somewhere at the same time I'd gotten there. "Holy shit!" I yelled, dropping the pizza and the cookie on the ground. As soon as I did, the man disappeared from view. I reached for my phone to call the police, but the old woman stopped me, telling me she had already tried and couldn't get a signal. She was trying to keep quiet in the house and didn't even want me trying to talk on the phone in case I alerted the man. "That's insane," I told her. "Don't you have a gun or something?" She told me she didn't keep one. I suggested we go into the kitchen together and grab some knives. She agreed this was a good idea. I followed the lady, and we were there in a few seconds when I began to hear tapping on the window once more. I turned and looked over to the kitchen window, only to see the man there again, tapping his knife on the windowsill before disappearing out of view once more. I ran over to the knife block, and that's when I noticed something. The woman's chef knife was not in her knife block. I mentioned this to her, and the woman's entire demeanor instantly changed. "Well, that's because my husband has it. He'll be coming into the house now." The door in the kitchen then opened. I realized not only had it not been locked, it had been a setup from the very start. The crazed-looking man, who I realized must be this woman's husband, walked into the house. I reacted totally on instinct. I was still at the knife block, so I grabbed it. I didn't really have time to take out the other knives, so I simply picked the whole damn block up and threw it at both of them. I ran towards them and knocked the old man over while I made my way to the back door. I ran around the side of the house, and momentarily slid on a patch of ice and fell down. I did manage to get back up quickly, but the moment I did, I saw the front porch light come on and the old man come shooting out. As I began to run, I saw the old woman coming at me from behind, so I took off. It was so slippery that I slipped again when I got to my car. I slammed my head against the window. Still though, I managed to open the car before either of them were able to get their hands on me. The crazy old man even tried to bust my car window by stabbing it with his knife. Luckily, my window was more than a match for his puny arms and did not shatter. I put the car in reverse and backed it out of the driveway. I would like to tell you that as I pulled out, I changed my mind and ran the car back into those two old shits. But I didn't. I just wanted to get the hell out of there and call the cops. When the cops investigated, it was much worse than I could have ever imagined. The couple who attacked me did not live in that house, as you might have guessed. In fact, they had broken in and even murdered the older woman who actually lived there. They were obviously going to try and kill me too. They hightailed it before the cops arrived. I have PTSD from the experience. I had to quit my job at the pizza place and just got myself a work-study job. I went off to college in a different state, and I don't come back home for the holidays now. When I was a sophomore in high school, I joined the basketball team. Although I did make the team, I very rarely got to play. I was not particularly tall, but I was a really good free throw shooter. I was pretty much only used when the game was close towards the end. If the other team was going to intentionally foul, I'd be given the ball. Well, this was high school basketball, so that rarely happened. In order to make sure I didn't get too rusty, I would stay behind at school to get in some regular practice. In fact, I practiced so hard that many times I ended up being one of the last people to leave the school building each day. On a Friday in early December, I was at school rather late practicing when I needed to refill my water. I walked out of the gym and down the hallway. Along the way, though, I noticed that somebody seemed to be standing outside this set of double doors. When this person saw me, they began to start banging on the doors to get my attention. Obviously, I was not allowed to let anybody into the building after hours, but this guy just kept on banging, trying to get me to come over. I walked over quickly to let him know I would not be able to do anything or let him in. He told me he was a school janitor and that he'd forgotten his keys inside his office. He begged me to let him inside. I just shrugged him off and let him know that I couldn't do anything. Then I walked away. However, he just kept on banging away. After I filled my water bottle up, I walked back to the gym. The guy was still there, slamming on that door, trying to get my attention. I figured the best thing to do was just ignore him, so I didn't acknowledge him the second time. All this did was piss him off, though. Actually, he called me a few expletives through the door. Yeah, 'cause that's the way to get me to help you out. Back in the gym, I went back to my monotonous routine to free throw. I would usually land about 9 out of 10 throws. I had gone through about 20 straight hits when I finally missed one. The ball bounced off the hoop and rolled over to those side double doors. As I walked over, I noticed it was now snowing pretty hardcore outside. I considered just calling it a day and walking home before the snow got too bad. I reached down to pick up that ball, only to stand up and be met eye to eye with this guy claiming to be a janitor. He didn't say a single thing to me, just stared me in the eye for what seemed like an eternity. All of a sudden, the corner of his mouth curved into a half smile. He grabbed the door handle and yanked on it. Of course, he didn't get in, but he railed at the door a bit, his eyes never leaving mine. He must have known that he had shaken me up pretty bad, because the half smile gave way to a full, demented smile. Then he turned and walked away. I decided it might not be best to leave right now. Maybe I'd better just waste time in the gym and wait for that guy to get bored and leave or something. I wasn't worried about getting home in the snow because I didn't live very far away from the school, so I practiced for another hour and a half instead. Surely that would be enough time for the guy to leave. When I finally left, it was snowing pretty hard now. I even stood at the door for another 20 minutes to make sure the man was not still out there. Obviously, I'd pissed him off, but it's not like I'd done anything wrong. I mean, how crazy would you have to be to spend nearly 2 hours in a fierce snowstorm just to wait for me to get out? I left the school. It was dark and the snow was falling hard and fast. It didn't take long before my shoes were completely soaked over. I almost cursed myself for waiting so long to go home. Suddenly, though, I felt someone grab at me from behind, knocking me face first onto the ground. I fell hard and got snow in my eyes, and lost my backpack as well. When I was finally able to get my bearings once more, I saw the man from earlier, standing behind me holding my backpack in his hand. I was scared to death at first, thinking he was going to beat the crap out of me for not helping him earlier. Instead, he simply stood there in the snow watching me. He then held his hand out, as if to offer to help me up. I was cautious to accept it, but I was having a hard time getting up on my own. He yanked me back to my feet, then shoved my backpack back into my hands. All the while, he just kept staring into my eyes, that same half smile on his face. I reached out and yanked my backpack away from him, or at least tried to pull it over to me. At first, he held on quite tightly to it. After a bit of back and forth, though, he released his grip, and I stumbled back slightly. I took my backpack and nervously thanked him for helping me. He didn't respond, though. His smile just grew even bigger. Nervously, I turned and began to walk home, although I kept watching him as I walked away, expecting him to bum rush me or something. He didn't do anything, though. He didn't even slowly follow me or anything like that. He just stood there, watching me as I walked home. I turned onto the streets and actually went around the block just to make sure he wouldn't know where I was going. By the time I'd actually gotten into my house, the man was nowhere to be found. My parents were home and I felt completely safe now. I got cleaned up and had a nice dinner with them. By the time my parents had gone to bed, I'd nearly forgotten all about the encounter. I decided to do a bit of homework before bedtime, though, so I went to my room and over to my desk. I got my backpack, put it on my desk, and I opened it. I reached in to grab my textbooks, only to notice they were wet. Now I was pissed off at myself for getting snow in my bag. To my surprise, though, when I withdrew my hand from my bag, it was not covered in snow. It was covered with blood. I dropped the bag to the floor. Freaked out, I grabbed it by the bottom and dumped all the contents onto the floor. Books, pencils, notebooks. All of a sudden, what seemed to be half the body of a Yorkshire Terrier fell out onto the floor. It looked like it was cut in half at the head, chest, and front paws, bloodying my bag. I screamed, waking my parents up and bringing them to the room. I didn't see that man again, so I assume he didn't want any further revenge. It didn't really matter, though. What he had already done was bad enough. When I started working out a year ago to get into better shape, I had what I considered to be an ingenious idea. The gym was only about a mile away from my home, so in order to get the best workout I could, I would walk to the gym for a warm-up. My cool-down would be the walk home. That way, I would get 2 miles of walking added onto my workout every day. It was pretty great, actually, and I began to lose weight very swiftly. I have to admit that once it started getting cold and snowy outside, I started to feel like I should just drive instead. Still, though, it had become such a part of my routine that I wasn't able to do so even when it got really cold. The one time I did try driving, I felt really guilty about it, so I didn't do it again. Instead, I just kept walking. The night my story takes place was one such night that I definitely should have driven. In fact, the weather itself should have been enough to indicate this to me. It was only in the upper 20s. It was snowing outside, but at least snowing lightly for now. When I headed out to the gym, the snow wasn't even sticking, so I grabbed my bag, put on my jacket, and headed out with confidence. I live in a small suburban town, and it was already quite dark out. There weren't many people out on the streets, and that was the way I really liked it. I felt like I had the whole town to myself almost as I walked along. The snow began to fall a bit harder as I continued, though. My visibility quickly became more limited. Still, though, this was not enough to get me to turn around and go home. The snow was not sticking. I thought I would be just fine. When I turned the corner past a liquor store, I jumped a bit when another man started coming down the corner. He was a little smaller than I was and was not dressed well for the weather. He was only wearing jeans and a jean jacket. We nearly collided, actually. "Oh, whoa, sorry, excuse me," I said to the man. He didn't acknowledge me at all, didn't even look up. He was wearing a black baseball cap and had it sitting low on his forehead. I couldn't get a good look at his face. The man just kinda shuffled along. Didn't reply to me, didn't even look at me, least of all apologize to me, since he was equally to blame for the near collision. As the man walked by, I shook my head and muttered under my breath into the wind, "Asshole." Right out of the corner of my eye, I saw the man stop in place. I froze. I couldn't believe he'd heard me over the wind. I looked over to him, only to see he had turned around and was now staring daggers at me. The snow was falling harder now. His face was partially obscured by it. He just looked at me, didn't say a single word, made no attempt to communicate, to move towards me. After a few moments, I apologized once more and decided to make my way back to the gym. I kept on looking over my shoulder to see if the man was following me. He didn't, but I could see him standing there for a long time, tracking my movements as I walked away. I couldn't calm down at all until I'd arrived at the gym. It was a 24-hour facility, but had no active staff after 5 p.m. I had a key card instead that gave me access to the building. Getting there, I felt safe finally, because unless that guy was a gym member as well, there was no way he was getting inside. I was alone at the gym at this time, which I did prefer as well. The town I lived in was not huge, so coupled with the snow, it wasn't too surprising nobody was in the mood to work out. One side of the building was all windows. I kept on glancing out of them as I worked out. The snow was falling harder and harder, and now it began sticking. After I had lifted some weights, I got onto one of the treadmills, which was right in front of a window. I hopped on and began jogging. I was jogging for about 15 minutes when I noticed the snow was really piling up now. Hell, I could only see a few feet in front of the gym. The falling snow was having a bit of a hypnotic effect on me. I just kinda stared out into it as I jogged. Suddenly, the man in the jean jacket stepped out of that falling snow, right into my line of sight, and shocked me out of my trance. It caught me off guard. I tripped, falling onto the treadmill, which then knocked me onto the floor. I cursed myself for not wearing the shutoff key. At least I hadn't been hurt that bad, though. Looking up once more, I could see the man had now disappeared. I shook my head. Surely he just wanted to startle me, get his revenge, and be on his way. I finished the rest of my workout, which took about an hour or so. The whole time, the man never showed up again, so I figured I must have been right. I wasn't particularly worried. Over a foot of snow had accumulated since I'd arrived at the gym, and it was still falling steadily as well. I was dreading the walk home now, so I figured I should just go and get it over with. I flipped my bag over my shoulder and made my way out into the snow. It sucked big time, my feet working through the open foot of snow, snowflakes falling and stinging my eyes. I had to keep blinking constantly in order to even see where I was going, and I had to walk very slowly as well. I swore to myself I'd never do this again, and whenever it snowed in the future, I would just drive. I then turned the corner at the liquor store. I stopped when I saw the man again, this time standing in front of the doors facing right at me, like he had been waiting. I was so startled I slipped and fell on my ass in the snow. I looked at the man. He didn't move a muscle. This time I noticed he was wearing a strange white mask. He had no features, just eye holes. It shook me. I hopped to my feet quickly. The man just kept on looking. A bit rattled, I figured he must be hanging around the liquor store for some reason. Grabbing my bag, I headed back on my way, all while watching him as closely as I could. Unfortunately, I couldn't see beyond a few feet, so it wasn't long before I couldn't see him at all. That walk home was scary as hell. The snow was falling. I was scared of tripping. It was so cold the ground was freezing solid. I had to walk slowly to keep from sliding. The whole time looking back behind me to see if the man was following me. That 1-mile walk seemed like a much longer journey than usual. With each slow step forward, I'd look behind me again. I turned, only this time to be met face to face with a white mask. This time, however, he didn't just stare at me. He grabbed me and shoved me down. It was easy. Although I was bigger than him, he had leverage, and he used it well. Before I had a chance to get up, he kicked me right in the crotch. While I was holding myself in pain, I looked at him. He pulled out one of those butterfly knives. I felt a jolt of terror, and despite the agony I was in, I tried to get up and run. He was so quick, though. He was right on me. He pinned me to the ground. I tried to push him off, but I couldn't do it. At first, he took the butterfly knife and pushed it up against my cheek. The blade punctured my skin, and I felt blood running down my face. As I looked into the dark eyes behind that mask, I really thought I was going to die right there. Feeling a surge of fear, something caused me to strike out. I slammed the guy right in his balls just like he had done for me. He dropped the knife, and I was able to kick him off me. He recovered much quicker than I did. As I turned to get up and run, he grabbed the knife once more and sliced at me, slicing through my shoe and cutting my foot open. I fell down again and slammed my face on the concrete of the sidewalk. For once, I was thankful for that foot of snow. It cushioned the fall a bit. Still, I could feel tears falling down my cheeks. I was convinced I was about to die. I tried to get up again. Something finally went my way. I got some leverage with my foot. When the guy moved toward me, I kicked him in the face. He slipped on the ice and fell back on his ass. He dropped his knife into the snow, and I kicked some snow into his eyes. I have no idea what effect it had. I turned around and just booked it out of there as quickly as I could. I tripped a few times, but I moved much faster than I ever have before. The rest of the walk home was terrorizing. I had no idea if this psycho would just appear out of the snow once more. Thankfully, I made it home safely. I locked the door and called the cops. The police came and took a statement. They wanted me to come down to the station. Afterwards, I went to the hospital for my cuts. It wasn't until I arrived that I found out why they wanted me there. It turns out the liquor store had been held up earlier, and the cashier had been stabbed to death. They figured it happened while I was at the gym, and the guy must have thought I'd called them. They didn't catch the man. Not only did I stop walking to the gym, I found a new gym to go to as well. I grew up on the countryside, right next to a national park frequently visited by nature lovers and bird enthusiasts. It was the kind of park where you're not really allowed to bike or ride horses, only walk or run. 10-year-old me felt it was a stupid rule though, and did so anyway. The trails were perfect for it after all. I knew full well that I was not supposed to do this, and had been caught a few times. Nothing much had ever come of it though, besides a half-hearted "don't do it again." I did, of course, until one day something frightening happened that made me finally stop. My family were horse breeders, you see, and I would often take the horses for a ride, usually in this forbidden park. This day, very early in the morning, the first day of the summer holiday, it was beautiful outdoors, misty and foggy, yet a sky that promised a sunny day ahead. Since it was so early, before 6 o'clock, I knew there wouldn't be anyone on the trail to see me. I let the horse set off full speed along the trail. I only slowed down on the part that got steep on one side, leading down to the river. The thought of one step too close to the edge was too much even for a daring kid with next to non-existent risk assessment skills. Suddenly, though, my horse came to a halt and refused to take another step. I'd grown up with horses all my life, and knew that usually indicated something needed to be investigated. Was there something wrong with his hooves? Did the horse spot something that spooked it? As I checked, his hooves seemed fine, but the horse still wouldn't move an inch. That's when I saw it, though. Someone had set up a trap, a thin, sharp metal wire across the trail. just in perfect neck height for an adult. I stopped and looked around. I couldn't see anyone. The wire was attached to 2 trees, impossible for me to remove. I led the horse around. To do so, I had to walk a bit up into the wooden area, onto the side of the trail. That's when I began to hear singing. Today, I only remember parts of it. Translated, though, it would have been something like, "Hey, all you runners, come here passing. Let the life of blood pour out." I, as silently as I could and with my heart in my throat, backed away, climbed onto my horse, and hurried back the way I came as fast as I could. I knew I had to tell someone about this. At the same time, I wanted to avoid admitting to riding a huge and very forbidden horse on these protected trails. Now I had a problem. The old stories about a mad old man living in the shed in the woods, a shed that was once a cottage for the local hunter, came back to me as I hung on to the horse for dear life. I got home and immediately told my older brother what had happened. He went back there with me in tow. We found the wire trap, and after a while of searching, we also found a spear-like pole in the ground, right in the spot where you'd land if you came running and jumped over the fallen tree on the trail. We called the police right away. The area was searched thoroughly, and several similar traps were found. No sign of the old man, though. The following summer, there was big news in the local paper about spear-like poles being found just under the water's surface, directly under a little tower you were supposed to dive from at the lake. Black garbage bags filled with big rocks were found on the narrow bridge crossing the river. If a car had hit those, it might have gone off the road and into the water. This happened in Antioch, California. It was around 2 a.m. or so. I was over at a friend's house, safe and warm in sheltered suburbia. We were having quite a lot to drink, chit-chatting and generally enjoying ourselves. Of course, when you're having so much fun, time hits the fast-forward button, and those few minutes can very quickly turn into an hour. I had too much to drink during that time. My friend has a bit of an abrupt bedtime, so I had to dodge out early, still very intoxicated. I felt too shameful, thinking I'd be asking too much to stay in his house to sleep off my own drunkenness. I suppose he was either too rude or too drunk to consider it himself. Whatever though. Sometimes a little bit of inconvenience can make you appreciate everything else you have. I needed about another hour or so to sober up and fully drive back. As fast as time passed by during my stay, it decided to dramatically slow down as soon as I stepped foot out of his house. It was a cul-de-sac area, a concrete jungle with the stem of the street breaking off into a fork. Alongside the road, my car was parked. The only street light that worked was in the middle of the cul-de-sac circle, about 80 yards away from that area. I stumbled drunkenly towards my car, keys in hand. I felt the metal line up, opened my door, and shifted my way into the back seat. Because this was a dark, strange, and unfamiliar neighborhood, I took the leftover newspapers and a sweater in my back seat to cover myself up. To be honest, even drunk, I was more than a little bit scared. I wanted to camouflage myself and not just be some guy awkwardly sitting in his own car waiting for time to pass to get less drunk. I couldn't fall asleep no matter what I tried, though. The uncomfortable feeling of a cheap backseat bed enshrouded in darkness didn't make the chance of slumber easier. I just had this ominous feeling. Of course, my mind began to wander. I thought of the worst-case scenarios, like how the police might shine their lights on me through the window, or a drunk driver suddenly hitting my car in the darkness. And wait, in the distance, about 100 yards away, I could now hear footsteps approaching me. The gravel scuffed with each step forward, growing in proximity, but periodically stopping in place. I wondered what was going on, until I started to make sense of it in my mind. Whoever this was probably peeking into cars carefully, with the intent to steal one. I couldn't recall exactly how many cars were on the block, but I'd counted 3 full stops till he was at my window. breathing. I froze. There must have been no more than 1 foot between us two. The car encapsulated me as I lay hidden beneath backseat clutter, trying my hardest to form into an object that had been strewn across the back seat, unmoving. "I see you," said a 40-year-old man in a perverse baby talk. Imagine you were playing hide and seek, and one of your friends tricked you into coming out. He said it exactly in that tone of voice, as if trying to bait me, like he was questioning whether the clutter in the back seat was just clutter, or a person in disguise. Of course, I didn't want to move a single inch to check that window. I remained as still as possible. Somebody better give me an Academy Award. My body reacted as well, minimizing my breathing so much I felt paralyzed. I dared not to look, my eyes fixated on the back of the passenger seat. I couldn't blink. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding so hard, it shook my body with each throb. The man began to circle around my car. I could hear his steps around me. It felt like I was part of the car now. I could feel him touching the trunk as he carefully pressed down on it, as if to test the alarm, as if to test me. I was in the middle of fight or flight panic. I couldn't do either without elevating the danger. Instead, I was frozen, hoping to God he was bluffing. He circled the car over and over. The door handle jiggled to my right. He was pulling on it multiple times. "I see you." Same tone, but more agitated and stressed, more convinced that he was trying to make the clutter move, revealing itself to be of his expectations, to be me. My muscles tensed up. I could hear metal tapping against the glass now. Was it a crowbar? A knife? A gun? My eyes stayed fixated on the seat in front of me, never averting my gaze. I was covered just enough to the point where I couldn't see beyond the seat at all. I knew I couldn't see anything, but I could feel his eyes resting on top of me. "My name is Poker Face. What's your name?" The tone changed, a serious, demented tone. I just sat there and accepted my death pretty much. I was ready for him to shoot me in the head through the window. Maybe stab me or something. Just at least make it bearable, not excruciating and slow like this. I imagined my friend waking up in the morning after a calm night of safe and sound sleep, only to discover me mutilated just a bit away from his own house. It was then I heard nothing but my own heart. What was this person doing now? I couldn't tell. Just staring at me in the middle of the night? Circling the car again? I didn't know. Time froze in place. It seemed he was now walking away. The footsteps were being swallowed into the distance. Thank God he left then. I didn't know how much longer I could hold it in. I waited another hour until the sun showed hints of itself. I jumped in my front seat and bolted out of there, wide-eyed and sober. This event happened to me this spring of 2015. I'm a young adult male living in Ontario, Canada. I joined a fairly popular BDSM website mid-January and was instantly drawn into the community. For those of you who don't know, BDSM is a variety of erotic practices involving bondage, dominance, submission, and masochism. Think 50 Shades of Grey if that helps. The community welcomes all kinks and fetishes alike, and everyone I've ever met from that site has been very welcoming and friendly. All except for one. It all started with me coming across her profile. A very gorgeous woman, long, fit legs and firm breasts. She was an older woman, but I was quite into that. I started by browsing her collection of photos, mostly fairly vanilla images of her sitting at a dining room table, drinking a glass of wine and smiling. Real classy stuff. That urged me forward. I went ahead and messaged her. I offered the usual greetings and wanted to chat and get to know one another. She replied almost instantly and greeted me as Sir given the role I took on the site. We continued to message back and forth for about a week or two. She explained to me that she wanted me to be her master since her last master had died in a car accident. That was a bit odd to me, but unfortunate accidents can happen to anyone, right? She continued giving me details of what she wanted me to do to her, and I'm very much obliged. The next couple of days, we kept trying to meet up for coffee, but unfortunately she had to cancel last minute each time. I began to get very eager, as all the kinky discussions had got me quite worked up. Late one night, she messaged me, inviting me over to her place. She explained to me that she didn't work in the morning this day, so we could at least have fun tonight. Being so worked up and lacking the necessary blood flowing through my brain to make an educated decision, I agreed and headed over to her address. She messaged me this address I didn't know, along with a phone number she said was her home line, and I got ready to head out. I got into my car and plugged the address into my GPS. This is where I noticed she lived in Hamilton, which was quite a far drive away. It's currently 1 a.m., but this didn't bother me much. I would drive there quite often, and considering I'd be spending the night anyway, I supposed I could just leave in the morning. A while later, I found myself passing into her town. Okay, so it's a little bit further than Hamilton, no big deal. Then though, I reached a stretch of highway void of streetlights. This is where I started to get concerned, as I only had my own headlights to go on now. Suddenly, my GPS chimed in, with the female voice indicating the next exit. It was coming up on the right. I was a bit nervous now. I gazed out into the darkness, just off the mild comfort of the highway. I'd have to drive down there. The exit took me to a dark, long stretch of country road. My red alarm started going off as I passed by silhouettes of farmhouses and forestry, a vast distance between each of them. My GPS chimed once again, indicating my destination was just ahead on my left. As I approached closer, it was not even close to what I had been expecting. Instead of a home or something like that, there was a small church house with a single yellow streetlight illuminating the dirt lot in front of it. I pulled into the lot and took a closer look with my vehicle's headlights pointing at the building. The windows and door were completely boarded up. Definitely not recently either, as the wood seemed to be even rotting. My blood began to run cold. I made sure all my doors were locked and my windows were rolled up fully. A full tank of gas gave me at least a bit of comfort in the situation. Maybe she just made an error typing out her address or something. I called the number she'd given me. There was an error noise immediately. The number you are trying to reach is no longer in service. Okay, at this point I was ready to turn around and leave right now, until I noticed my phone was alerting me to a new email. It was a message from her. Hey there, I see you're here already. It's not the church, by the way. My place is the small house behind there. All I could do was replay all the horror movies I'd seen throughout my life. I just couldn't possibly believe I'd be living out one in real life right now. A small jolt of curiosity persuaded me to at least look at what this house was. I could see there was a small path beside the church, and I slowly pulled up to it in my car. As I crept forward little by little, a small farmhouse poked itself out of a bunch of trees at the top of the hill. At this point, I was certain I was not going in there. I'd made my decision in my head that my own survival took precedency over my need for sex. I was just about to reverse out of there until I saw the upstairs balcony open. A hooded figure stepped out. I couldn't see their face, but I could tell by the posture and shape it was definitely a man. Despite the darkness of their facial features, I could feel they were looking right at me. He stood there for 60 seconds before he motioned his head in such a way I recognized it as the universal signal for look behind you. In that moment, I felt the metal handles on the outside of my driver door being tugged at. I quickly turned my head in that direction, only to see the woman from the profile photos hunched over and pressing her face up against my window. My heart leapt out of my chest as I stared at her horrifying smile. The best way I can describe her expression would be to imagine the creepiest cartoon image of the Joker you've ever seen. It was undoubtedly her behind that insane grin, only much older. She whispered through the glass, "Open the door, baby." I was frozen in my seat. I didn't know how to respond or what to do next. I sat there, continuing to stare like an idiot. Her face became angry. She had a malicious expression as she started to violently jiggle at the door handle and scream at the top of her lungs. "Open the door, now!" This knocked me out of panic mode. I pressed my foot on the gas. My car, set to reverse, began to shoot out of the pathway backwards. The woman even tried holding on to the door handle, only to let go shortly after being dragged off her feet. I fled back down the dark road towards the highway, almost triple the speed limit, just in case they had a car themselves and decided to chase me. I called a friend of mine who had also met on the same website. She lived in Hamilton as well, and insisted I come stay the night at her place. When I got there, she poured me a cold glass of Coke Zero, and I explained to her everything. She told me she'd recently read an article in the local paper over a week ago regarding an older couple luring men out to their farm. I stopped her right then and there, as I didn't want to know any more than I currently did. This just happened a few days ago, and I'm still extremely shaken up. For some backstory, I live on the second floor of a 3-level apartment. We have a crawl space that connects all of them together. None of us are exactly sure why it's even there, but we all have things stored in it, and none of us would ever even attempt to go inside of it, so we all felt pretty safe still. The other night, the sun was just setting, but it wasn't pitch black out or anything like that yet. I was walking through my living room when I saw a short woman on my fire escape looking in through my windows. This was extremely bizarre, considering it was still light out a bit, and she literally got onto our fire escape somehow. We have 2 windows the fire escape reaches. She was looking in through both, but didn't seem to see me. I crawled along the ground. My heart was racing as I watched her try and pry open the windows. I did not know what the fuck to do because my phone was all the way in the other room. After what felt like an eternity, she finally left. I went into my room to grab my phone, to text my landlord and call the cops. I came back into the living room and was looking out the windows to see if I could still locate her, when all of a sudden, I heard a weird noise coming from my ceiling. We have one of those tile ceilings, made out of separate slabs of cork/wood. I looked up, only to see one of the slabs being lifted up, and 2 eyes peering down at me. I have no clue how she'd gotten into the crawl space so quickly, but I grabbed the nearest thing next to me, which happened to be a broom, and started smacking her with it through the ceiling. I called the cops as soon as she started crawling away. They showed up and searched the place. Didn't find her until a few days later, when she was on someone else's fire escape trying to sneak in. The cops said she was definitely on some hard drugs, and she had reacted violently towards them. I'm glad that she's gone, but whoever that crazy lady that came through my ceiling was, I don't want to ever see them again. Okay, so this whole thing began about 2 months ago or so. At an aunt's party, my sister suddenly came up to me and told me she thought someone had been sneaking into her house in the middle of the night. My sister has always been easily scared, so at first I was pretty skeptical. I asked her how she knew someone had been in the house, whether she had actually seen anyone, etc. She told me she hadn't actually seen a person there, but she knew for a fact that someone had been in her house. She went on to explain that she has a skybox downstairs that streams to her bedroom television. The first time it happened, she said she'd heard the TV being used, so she turned on her own TV, only to find that someone was flicking through the channels. I didn't really buy what she was saying, but she did seem genuinely afraid. She claimed this had been going on for 3 months on and off. To put her mind at ease a bit, I told her I'd stay at her place for a few nights and wait to see if anyone came by. I even took my younger brother along just to be safe. All in all, we stayed in her place for about 4 nights. During those 4 nights, of course, nothing unusual happened. Me and my brother were only further convinced she was going insane. We decided we had stayed long enough and told her we had to go home. She got extremely upset about this. I reassured her though and told her to call the police instead the next time it happened. She had called the police once before about that guy. They turned up only to find nobody in the house. That further confirmed my suspicions. I told her she could call me anytime she wanted and I'd try my best to comfort her. Then I left for work. 2 days later, she called me at 11:30 p.m. and claimed the person was downstairs in her house right now. I asked her how she knew. She told me she could hear him walking around the house. She was whispering and crying, so I knew she wasn't making this up. I could tell just from the sound of her voice. I called my brother and told him to meet me at her house right now. I was on the phone with her the entire drive over, only about 10 minutes away. When I arrived there, my brother was already parked outside. We both went over to the back of the house, still on the phone with my sister. The first floor of the house was lit up by the TV in the living room. As we approached the patio door, we could see a man sitting on the couch facing us. We were frozen solid. My sister noticed we'd gone quiet and started asking what was wrong and if we could see him. I told her to stay silent no matter what. I hung up and called the police to explain the situation. The guy hadn't moved from the couch at all. The TV turned off though while we were waiting for the cops. Me and my brother majorly freaked out when it happened. Now we couldn't see anything downstairs. All of a sudden the hallway light turned on, meaning someone was making their way up the stairs. We opened the patio door in a hurry and ran up the stairs, only to catch the guy with his ear pressed against her door. We beat the shit out of him and got my sister out of the house ASAP. Turned out he had a knife tucked in his coat pocket. The cops came 10 minutes later. He could have easily killed her in that time if he had wanted to, which is fucking outrageous. It turns out the guy was one of our mom's old boyfriends who had lived with us for a while in the 90s. He'd always been fond of my sister, but we never suspected it would be him. He'd had nothing to do with any of us for almost a decade now. My sister moved back in with my mom after and is undergoing therapy to get over what happened. Our stepdad, as he liked to call himself, was given 3 years in prison, and we're doing the best we can to cut all ties with that creep. I've always had an innate fear of the night. Not so much the dark, but the night itself. As a child, my imagination was overcome with stories of creatures that only come alive at night, and safety offered by a house and light. I never had anything to base this fear off of, until a night when I decided to go with a buddy of mine to a baseball game and got stuck at a light at 2 a.m., just after dropping him off at home. Of course, that night the game had gone into extra innings, so I didn't get the chance to drop off my friend back home until well after 1 a.m. Everything was mostly fine on the way back, until I hit a light right before the street that led to my house. It was a T-junction, and I was turning left. The light was one of those that you might think was broken, until it finally turned green ages later, just when you were about to decide to run it. Of course, I just so happened to pull up immediately as the light turned red. I would have just gone forward, seeing as no one was there and it was closing in on 2 a.m. on a school night. But earlier that week, I'd heard this phrase, "Character is what you do when no one is looking." For whatever reason, this particular night, I decided to prove to myself that I was a man of sheer character. Big mistake. I pulled into a stop at the light, feeling real good about myself, almost bordering on self-righteous. I happened to look out the window to my left, only to notice a lady sitting all alone on a bus bench. We made brief eye contact and I quickly looked away. It was too late though. I could see movement out of my peripheral vision and knew she was coming my way already. I looked out the window and noticed she was carrying some sort of bag. I quickly checked that my doors were locked and all of my windows were fully up as well. I moved my right foot to the accelerator, just in case, and braced myself for what was to come. I was hoping it would just be an awkward exchange, praying for a quick light change before she even reached me so I could just get out of here. I knew there was slim chance of that though. She walked right up to my window, put down her bag on top of my car, and began to tap against the glass. I nervously looked up at her, and she motioned for me to put my window down. I had automatic windows, so I was just imagining pushing too hard on the window button and accidentally making it come all the way down. I took a deep breath and flicked it as lightly as possible with my finger. The window moved a microscopic bit, but she didn't seem to notice or care. She leaned in and began to talk to me. "My boyfriend just beat me up. I have a friend who lives just down the street. Can you give me a ride?" I should stop and give a brief physical description of this bag lady. She was small and extremely skinny, so much so that I couldn't exactly determine her age. She could have been 18 years old with a rough life on the street, or a 60-year-old little lady. It was hard to tell. All that is to say, just by looking at her, there was no way to verify her story. She looked beat up by life, not by her boyfriend. There was something about her delivery, though, so robotic and practiced, like she was disconnected from this moment. It made my skin crawl. After a brief debate on whether or not I should do it, I told her I had to get home, and unfortunately could not give her a ride right now. After my refusal, though, she leaned in a bit closer and began to repeat the exact same thing again. "My boyfriend beat me up. I have a friend who lives just down the street, and could you give me a ride?" This time I felt much more confident when I declined her offer and told her I had a curfew and had to get home right now. She just began to repeat her statement again, like she was a machine playing it on repeat. At this point, the light changed. I lifted my other foot off the brake and started slowly rolling forward. I began to mutter an apology. She didn't move at all. She looked at the light, then looked down at me. She leaned in even closer, her face all the way up against the window, and said 5 words that have haunted me ever since. "You made the right decision." She picked up her bag and walked back towards the bench. I peeled out of that intersection and screamed all the way home. I have no idea what she planned to do, or if there were people waiting to jump in my car from the bushes or something had I moved to let her in. That encounter has haunted me ever since, though, and confirmed in my mind that nothing good happens after dark. I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. It's a beautiful area with hundreds of miles of national forest, some great state parks, and a ton of fantastic camping places. Unfortunately, my hometown is also relatively poor. While there are some out-of-town residents from Atlanta and other places, a lot of people where I live are dirt poor. I do freelance work as a technical writer, so I can do most of my work online. If I didn't have that going for me, though, I'd absolutely have to move somewhere else. It's one of those small towns that will rob you of your ability to accomplish anything in life if you get stuck there, without anything else going for you at least, excluding a handful of doctors, lawyers, and Georgia Power Company employees. The only employment in area is Walmart, fast food, and maybe if you're lucky working at a grocery store. To the east of my town, there's this massive national forest. It's loaded with great camping sites and lots of relatively unused hiking trails. I really enjoy going on them with my dog, but it can be a bit of an unnerving experience sometimes. It's a 10-mile drive out from town, and there's no cell phone service or homes for many miles. In the past, there had been a lot of vehicle break-ins at the trailheads as well. It was so bad that the gravel parking lots glittered with bits of broken glass from what I'm assuming were car windows. Sometimes there were really shifty people hanging around as well, or just driving around on the forest roads. These were some really rough roads too. You'd see these beat-up $500 cars, just barreling along roads meant for a 4x4. Some of these people you see in those cars, you can just tell at a glance that they're shady. All that being said, it was still my favorite place to camp. You just had to be a bit careful. A few years ago, 2 of my friends and I decided to go play paintball in the national forest. Probably not legal. We decided to turn this paintball expedition into a full-on camping trip so we could play the next morning as well. After a pretty uneventful first day of shooting paintballs at one another, we drove a couple of miles to one of the more popular camping spots. Unfortunately, a church group or something had taken up every spot in the area. This was really the only spot we were familiar with, and it was getting quite late at this point. We had to keep on looking for another. We drove about an hour further into the woods. By this time, it was really getting dark, and we were getting really worried about finding a new spot. We all had GPS on our smartphones, but none of us could get any service. We turned off onto an unfamiliar road that was in very rough shape. In fact, it looked like the Forest Service Rangers had used a backhoe to block off the road with a mound of dirt. A broken metal barrier lay in the woods nearby. It looked like 4x4 vehicles had been going over the mound, so it was pretty worn down at this point. Our F-150 had pretty high clearance, so we decided to just go over the mound. There was this old gravel road on the other side, pretty much clear of debris. We drove a few more miles down this road and came across an opening next to a small creek. There were some blue tarps hanging over a plywood picnic table nailed to a tree. This was a pretty odd set piece. That being said, it was pretty much dark at this point. We couldn't keep driving around all night in the woods looking for a camping spot. We left the truck light running and went to set up the tent. As we were doing so, I started to notice there was a lot of trash in the woods surrounding the site. I could see a green bottle laying on the ground. Took a look at the label only to see it was a bottle of home and garden insecticide. I was really tired at the time. I thought someone must have been dumping their garbage out illegally here. None of us really thought it was weird that someone would be dumping garbage in an area more than an hour away from the nearest home. We set up camp, grabbed some beers, and made chili from scratch. By this time, it was around 11 p.m. As we were eating, though, we noticed a faint glow coming from the other side of a nearby hill. At first, we thought it was moonlight filtering its way through the trees. However, the angles just didn't make sense. It didn't seem to be a bright light, and it wasn't moving either. It was kind of like that glow you'd see when looking out over a bright city. We couldn't identify the source itself, though. Since there were no other access roads in the area, it couldn't be other campers. The hill was about a quarter mile from our campsite, so we decided to go and investigate this odd occurrence. Under normal circumstances, I probably wouldn't have done so. However, we'd all had a few rum and cokes in our stomachs, so 2 of us, Jacob and I, decided we'd go take a quick look. My other friend Isaac decided to stay behind and pop some popcorn or something. We started walking toward the light source, and the situation got even stranger. As we looked on, all the trees in the area had their bark knocked off in a circle around their trunks. At first, we thought it could have been the work of a beaver that lived in the creek or something. But that didn't make any sense. Why would a beaver go around all these trees and just knock the bark off in a circle? Jacob and I started talking about this ghost beaver in a pretty loud voice, probably due to our sheer drunkenness. As we were about to crest the top of the hill, Jacob tripped on a rock and shouted out, "Oh shit!" A few seconds after he yelled, the light, whatever it was, went out. We looked at each other. Maybe we really didn't need to see what that light was after all. We walked back in silence, looking back over our shoulders every few seconds. We decided to turn off our flashlights as well, and just use the moonlight to get back. When we arrived within a couple 100 feet of the campsite, I could see Isaac walking in circles around it. He was wearing a hooded coat I hadn't seen him wearing before, and for some reason, he was now carrying his paintball gun in his hand. That seemed a bit odd. The fire had started to die down now, so we couldn't see anything else very well. At this point, we'd been gone for almost an hour. From the distance, it looked like Isaac was looking for something. He kept on walking around the site, peering into the tent occasionally. Only, when we had almost arrived back, we saw Isaac walk up the road we'd come in on. We figured he was going to use the bathroom and didn't want to wander through the woods like us or something. When we got back, we sat next to the fire and waited for him to return. All of a sudden, we saw him lurch out of the tent instead. He stumbled a few feet forward and vomited. After we had left, he'd had a few more rum and cokes, he mumbled. Well, we asked him why he'd kept on wandering around the campsite with the paintball gun, and he got a strange look on his face. They're locked up in the cab of the truck. Did you unlock it or something? We went and checked, entered the door code, and saw all our paintball equipment just as we'd left it before. The keys to the truck were still hidden. I got a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. Isaac, what were you doing after we left? I was watching a movie on my phone and then I fell asleep, I guess. That was you walking around with your paintball gun just then, right? Isaac said he'd been in the tent ever since we'd left, and he had been wearing the same unhooded fleece all night. Someone had been walking around our campsite searching, and it was not Isaac. At this point, all of us were way too drunk to drive, but we decided to go ahead and pack up and go back to my house for the night. We didn't even bother packing up the tent. We just folded it down with the sleeping bags and everything in it. We jumped in the F-150, and I started to drive out. When we got to the dirt hump, I could see something gray blocking our path back. The metal barrier that had been laying in the woods earlier was back on its stand, right on top of the hump earlier. By this point, all of us had sobered up to the situation. No one wanted to leave the car to move it out of the way. I had a metal guard on the front of the F-150, so I drove forward slowly, tapping the metal barrier with the front of my truck. I guess it popped off with the force, and we drove over it slowly. We were terrified it would pop one of the tires as we drove over, but thankfully it didn't. As we continued to drive down the road, I could see a vehicle following us with its lights off, probably 1,000 feet behind us. I almost wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't kept catching glimpses of it as the moonlight reflected off. I started to drive as fast as I could on that forest road, and the other vehicle kept pace behind. It never got any closer though. It just stayed 1 or 2 turns behind us. We could only see it when the road straightened out. After about 45 minutes of speeding along gravel roads, we made it back to the main paved road. I started to drive everyone back to my house, but I decided to go a different way just to be safe. I didn't get pulled over for a DUI somehow. Camping can be very fun, but rural camping can be dangerous. I've driven past that metal barrier since that time, but it's always been in place like it's supposed to be. I would never go down that road again at night though. This story takes place in August of 2013 in the mountains of southern Oregon. I'm a USAF Security Forces airman, a military policeman basically. My girlfriend was at work, and as a swelteringly hot day began to turn into thunderstorms, my buddy Nick and I decided to go explore some back roads to get out of the heat in town. Southern Oregon is crisscrossed with logging roads, some actively used, but many more totally forgotten and grown over. Nick and I had spent many a day starting off on roads that we knew, finding roads we didn't know, and driving for hours into the mountains, eventually navigating back to paved roads. On this particular day, with storm clouds building over those mountains, we set off on a road we had never been on before and began our drive outward. After driving for around an hour or so, we hadn't seen nor heard any sign of any other people in these woods. We rounded a bend in the thick fir woods and emerged in a meadow that was totally surrounded by aspen groves. This meadow was perfectly flat and eerily still. We both noticed the strange stillness almost immediately. No birds, no insect noise, no squirrels, certainly no other people either. On the other side of the meadow, right at the edge of the tree line, we could see a picnic table. The table was very odd, however. It was painted bright orange and was much larger than a typical picnic table you'd see in a park. Remarking on the strangeness of this, Nick drove through the meadow to get a closer look. I remember being very apprehensive as we approached. The whole scenario was exceptionally strange. The overall silence of the area was very unsettling. It was nearly impossible to see far into the trees, as the aspens grew extremely close together. When we parked by the table, I hopped out of the passenger seat of the truck to check it out. I'm not very tall, only about 5'5". Regardless, the table was ridiculously oversized and practically unusable. The seats were at my chest level. I would have had to climb up to even sit down. As I was looking over this weird thing, Nick called me over to the truck, and I noticed he was now glancing out into the aspens. At first, I couldn't see what he was looking at. Then, though, I noticed a splash of color, completely out of place in the thick trees. It was almost hidden away, a small one-man tent set back in the trees about 50 feet from this strange table. I had a feeling of dread and felt certain that someone must be in there. If we could see that tent, they could see us as well. There were no campgrounds in this area, no people, no main roads for miles. Surely someone this remote and trying to hide would at the very least be a strange person. As we observed the tent, though, we didn't see any movement nor hear any sounds coming from it. Nick suggested I call out. I didn't want to, but I still did so anyway. "Hey, anyone in there?" I yelled. No reply. Feeling completely on edge, Nick and I thought about just driving away and leaving this strange area. We began to fear the worst, though. What if there was a body in this tent? What if somebody had gotten kidnapped or something and they were hiding out here? Foolish, I know, but we thought it all the same. After some debate, we decided to have Nick turn the truck around to drive away from the camp. Should we need to leave in a hurry, he would be waiting behind the wheel. With my heart pounding, I started walking through the trees towards this tent. I was totally keyed up, with my senses on full alert. As I reached the campsite hidden in the trees, several things struck me as odd immediately. I could see backpacks were scattered all over. No fire had been built, no wood collected. The tent was it was full of backpacks, and women's clothing as well. Full of dread, I turned to leave and tell Nick what I had just seen. As I turned, though, I could hear Nick now yelling, "Come on, man, let's go! Let's get the fuck out of here!" I didn't know why he was yelling now, but I ran back to the truck nonetheless. When I broke out of the trees, I could see a beat-up old Ford Taurus on the road, blocking us from exiting. I leapt into the passenger seat, and Nick floored the gas pedal. The car was occupied by 2 men, a third person laying against the window in the back. As we drove across the meadow, the driver attempted to block us in from the road. Nick barely managed to swerve around them and accelerated the way we had come from. I looked back, only to see the car attempting to turn around on the narrow road and follow. Nick drove like a madman, and though I was honestly terrified they would catch up, we hit the highway without seeing that car again. I don't know if the person in the back was male or female. I called the state police immediately, and they promised to send a trooper out to check the scene. I received a call the next day from a trooper, though, stating the campsite, the backpacks, and the women's clothing were all gone. He could tell people had been in the area, though. The strange table was still by the grove. I've not returned to that area since, and I don't intend to ever again. When I was 18, I spent quite a lot of time in the Cohuta Wilderness. My favorite spot was this set of waterfalls several miles from the nearest parking area. Most visitors just parked in the RV area and swam in the creek right along the gravel road. In the 2 years I'd hiked all those trails, I had never seen anyone further than a half-mile in. Anyway, one Saturday, I took my girlfriend to see these beautiful waterfalls, since she had never had the opportunity to see one in person before. We set off along the trail, when not 15 minutes into our walk, she grabbed my arm and got real quiet. She told me she felt like she was being watched, and had those heebie-jeebies. I assured her that everything was safe. The only thing I'd ever had to worry about in this part of the woods were the occasional bear or maybe a copperhead. We continued on, but instead of leaving, the feeling of being watched just kept on getting worse and worse for her. I figured at first she just wasn't used to the wilderness yet and was having a bit of trouble adjusting. A couple of hours later, we finally reached the end of the trail and had a picnic at the bottom of the falls. After we finished eating, she tried to check her cell phone for messages, only to panic when she realized we had no service. I calmly explained to her that there was no cell reception anywhere around for miles. We were finally alone and could just enjoy some peace and solitude. This, of course, made her panic even worse. We decided to start heading back almost immediately. She was clearly scared, and I couldn't help but smile, thinking it was very silly. On the way back, I explained to her how many times I'd been out there all alone, and I'd never had any problems. Still, though, she just couldn't shake that feeling of being watched. We were about a mile from the falls now, on the only trail around, when suddenly, we heard someone call out to us from behind. I nearly jumped out of my skin and turned to see a man walking towards us. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder and a heavy beard with his hat tipped low over his face. My girlfriend took a small step behind me. Hello, sir. What can I do for you?" I asked, trying to sound friendly.
"Oh, you guys left your cell phone back by the falls," he said,
a slight grin on his beard as he looked at my girlfriend. "Oh, thanks for the assist, buddy," I said, extending my hand. He shook his head. He told me he hadn't brought it with him. It was still sitting up there. Maybe we should follow him instead and come get it ourselves. We politely declined, of course, and made our way back down the trail as quickly as possible, him following us the entire way and trying to stay out of sight. I noticed that he'd followed us all the way back to our car even. She showed me her cell phone was still in her pocket when I opened her door. Ever since that, I didn't go back on that particular trail again. In May of 2009, I had just broken up with my girlfriend of almost 3 years. We had moved from Calgary to Toronto and were stuck living together after the breakup, as we didn't know many people in the city yet. Needless to say, the situation was pretty stressful and very upsetting. When a buddy I was going to school with at the time suggested a weekend camping and fishing trip, I jumped at the chance to leave. He grew up in an area about an hour outside of Toronto called Flamborough. It's really beautiful. Loads of lush forest, farmers' fields, and small rivers and creeks. We decided to camp and fish along a particular creek named Grindstone Creek. It was close to a wetland area, and the fishing was supposed to be really good. We ended up setting up our camp in what was probably a farmer's field, guessing it was trespassing on our part, bordered by a gorgeous forest. We spent the evening fishing, shooting the shit, and drinking some quality craft beers. As it got darker, we made a little fire and roasted potatoes and hot dogs. It was a pretty good and fun night, actually. We turned in just after midnight and shared the tent together. My buddy fell asleep before me. I stayed up playing on my phone until around 1:30 or so. I must have drifted off at some point, because next thing I remember, I was being woken up by a high-pitched yipping type noise. I was kind of groggy still, and it took me a moment to fully wake up. The yipping was incessant and sounded like a weird coyote or something. I laid there for a moment listening, then started playing on my phone again. That noise was annoying as hell. I tried my very best to ignore it, but it sounded like it was getting a lot closer. Finally, it sounded like it had to be no more than 10 feet away. At this point, I became very unsettled. I had seen coyotes in Calgary before, and I thought of them as pretty harmless. They never looked much bigger than a small dog. But what if this one was rabid or something? What if it could smell our food and brought its buddies? I have a pretty bad anxiety disorder, so I was very prone to worrying about these types of thoughts. I nudged my buddy to see if he was awake, only to see that the noise had woken him up too. We discussed about what we would do to this coyote, as we hadn't brought anything to scare off critters. Not a BB gun, nothing really. Finally, he decided he would just shine the flashlight at it and holler quite a lot, hopefully scaring the animal off. He unzipped the tent, and I watched him point the flashlight out into the darkness. I'll never forget what happened next. He peeked his head out. His legs suddenly went all wobbly, and he sort of stumbled backwards in shock. He had this dumbfounded look on his face and started to babble. "It's not a coyote, it's a dude out there. Some weird dude." Normally, I would have thought he was messing with me. I'm a huge wimp and scare easily, so that was the type of thing he would do. But I had never seen someone look so genuinely scared. I never want to see that expression on someone's face again either. I knew he couldn't be pulling my leg. The weird yipping and howling noises were still going on. In retrospect, it didn't really sound like a coyote. I guess in our groggy states, it was a way for our brains to make sense of it. My friend kept on telling me to take a look and make sure he was not going crazy. At this point, I was having a full-blown anxiety attack. My heart was racing. I felt like shit, but I had to look. I slowly peeked out of the flap and waited for my eyes to adjust, and that's when I saw him. A man, standing only a few arms lengths away from the tent. He was swaying back and forth, wearing a baseball cap. What made it really awful, though, what was really creepy, was that he was only wearing women's lingerie. That's when I knew there was most likely something very wrong with this guy. I pulled my head back inside the tent, and my buddy and I discussed what to do. Finally, we decided to yell at the guy. My buddy started yelling first. "Hey dude, can you fuck off? We're trying to sleep in here." The noise stopped. It was dead silent. We heard the footsteps running towards our tent. They stopped right outside. We didn't waste any time. We started yelling again. "Seriously, fuck off. We have cell phones in here. If you don't fuck off, we're gonna call the Rangers." With that, we heard him walk by the tent and head off, moving towards the road, it sounded like. Needless to say, we laid awake, petrified until the first sign of sunlight. Then we hightailed it the hell out of there. We discussed our experience on the way home, and were both pretty embarrassed about how we'd handled the situation. Definitely not handling it the best on either of our parts. I think we're both ashamed because of how we let some weirdo freak us out so much. We haven't really ever talked about it since that day. I always wonder just what the hell that guy was doing out there, and what the hell was wrong with him either. I wonder if things would have turned out differently if we were a couple of girls instead of two guys. I'm not saying he was a serial killer or something, but it seemed like he was testing us when we were in the tent. I guess I'll never know, and for that, I'm kind of glad. So when I was 19, I casually dated this guy named Casey that I'd met through a mutual friend. We hit it off the first time we met and hung out for hours. He was incredibly charming and we had quite a lot in common as well. I was definitely, even at the start though, getting an off vibe. The day after we hung out, my friend texted me, warning me not to get too involved with him because he was kind of a psycho. I ignored his warning, which is something I came to regret to this very day. My friend wouldn't elaborate though, no matter how many times I asked, so I shrugged it off as probably nothing that extreme. Surely he'd tell me if it was, right? Casey and I were by no means serious. He said he planned on seeing other girls, and didn't even want to call me his girlfriend. I appreciated his straightforwardness, though my feelings were very hurt by this. I told myself that maybe if we got closer he would change his mind, but as I spent more and more time with him, I began to see exactly what my friend had been talking about. He had some serious anger issues. He would do things like throw plates against the wall if something wasn't fully cooked in the microwave, and casually talk about how on bad days, he fantasized about going on a shooting spree and getting away with it. I finally broke up with him after he told me in a fit of rage that he wished he could shove a fire poker down the neighbor's dog's throat so it would never bark again. Altogether, our fling lasted less than 5 months. He kept on trying to convince me to date him again in the following months, though. Obviously, I kept telling him no way. Eventually, I started dating my now husband. Casey made one last attempt to get me back by showing up at my apartment to tell me he was in love with me, and if he couldn't have me, then life was not worth living. He told me if I didn't let him in and try to work things out, he would shoot himself in the head. Since he had a gun on him, I was terrified of what he could do. I had no idea how to handle this situation, so I let him inside with the intention of keeping him as calm as I could. I texted one of his friends to come grab him and help him. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what happened after, but he kept on trying to kiss me, and when I made it clear we weren't going to be intimate, he beat the shit out of me. He left and left me bleeding and crying on the ground. I didn't tell my then boyfriend about this because I didn't want them to have an altercation. I made up excuses why I couldn't see him for weeks until all my marks had healed up. I had to tell my coworkers I was in a bike crash, but I could tell no one really believed that. Casey texted me apologizing, said he loved me so much that he'd snapped because he needed me. He tried to frame his violence as some kind of fucked up romantic gesture. I told him to never come near me again and threatened to call the cops as well. I was scared shitless for over a year that he would come back and attack me and kill me. After that incident, though, I didn't hear from him again. Fast forward to 6 years later. At this point, my husband and I had married and just had our first kid. She was 5, and we were fostering her with the intention of adopting her. We lived in a new state several hours away. Somehow, that I really can't figure out, Casey figured out I had a daughter. He messaged me on Facebook, saying he knew I had a daughter, and she must be his. I tried to explain that she was not my biological child, but he insisted I was lying, and she looked exactly like him. She wasn't even the same race, by the way. He's white with blonde hair and blue eyes, and she's Hispanic. I told him he was crazy, blocked him, and deleted all my photos of her from Facebook. My account was completely private. I even double-checked all my settings and my links to make sure there was no access, so I have no clue how he even got that information. Another few weeks went by without contact. I was feeling quite confident that was the last I'd ever hear from him, but I was so wrong. He showed up at my house, begging to talk. He looked like shit, and had clearly developed a serious drug habit over the years, far beyond just weed from the old days. His face was so pale, and he had these dark rings around his eyes. He was so shaky. My husband wasn't there, so I was pretty terrified. He begged me to meet her. Once again, I emphasized she was not my biological child, and told him he needed to stay away from my family or I would call the police. He started on this whole unhinged tangent about how we belonged together, and it wasn't fair for me to keep punishing him for not realizing that sooner. He went on about how after he'd found out about her, God told him while he was on meth that he needed to quit everything and get clean so he could be with me and raise our daughter. I just slammed the door in his face and told him I was calling the cops. He shouted back I couldn't keep him away from this child forever. I called the police, and all they did was file a report. Told me there was nothing they could do unless he threatened or harmed one of us. Well, about 3 months later, one day my daughter didn't come home on the bus like usual. I called the school, only for them to say she had been picked up by her dad. As you can imagine, the next few hours were complete and total hell on earth. My husband came home early from work, and we had to wait at the house with a cop and detective in case he took her home, while the other cops searched for them. The detective told me that from everything I'd told him, he didn't think he was at risk of harming her or fleeing with her. Luckily, he was right. They were found at a McDonald's, and he was arrested quickly, while my daughter was taken to the hospital. Thankfully, she hadn't been harmed physically. It was incredibly awkward to have to explain to a 5-year-old why a strange man she'd never met was telling her he was her dad. The prosecution was also insanely lenient on him due to his mental health issues and drug problem, coupled with the fact he hadn't harmed her. They ended up dropping all serious charges like kidnapping a minor and sentenced him to stay at a state hospital until he was deemed healthy enough to be let out, which ended up only being 4 months. They granted us a restraining order that lasted 2 years, but we were assured if he contacted any of us again, we would no doubt be able to get another one. It's 4 years later, and we haven't heard from him since. My daughter wasn't traumatized or anything, just saw it as a strange experience she had as a child. Me, though? I still have intense anxiety every time the doorbell rings. My husband bought a shotgun immediately after this went down. I've heard through the grapevine that Casey has been mostly clean besides being an alcoholic now. It's an upgrade from meth at least, I guess. He seems to be less batshit insane. That's nice, but I really hope I never see that man again for the rest of my life. This story goes back a few years ago, when I was a 17-year-old high school student. Every day, I'd walk the 25 to 30-minute journey to and from school. There was this shortcut I could take home that would take some time off the walk, and as a nature lover, the shortcut was very enjoyable as well. Whenever I'd walk home, I would take this shortcut to enjoy the small amount of forest we have in this medium-sized, moderately busy city I live in. It was pretty well traveled, and I would occasionally see other people walking from their neighborhood toward the busy streets close by, or other students walking home from high school or college as well. Sometimes, though, there would be no one else but me on this path. To give you an idea, it was definitely not well groomed or anything, but it was traveled enough that you could make out a distinct path from being trampled over the years. It started off from the busy road by my high school, then went into a low-lying, open wooded area with some small ponds around. After a few minutes of this, I could veer right up the big hill towards the parallel street to my street. One day, I happened to be walking home from school after staying a bit late for some extra help. A few minutes into my shortcut, I noticed a guy sort of standing off the main path a bit, minding his own business seemingly while talking on a cell phone. There was an open backpack sitting on the ground by his feet. I suppose this wasn't unusual by any means, since the entire low-lying area was traveled, and there were numerous paths off the main path leading different directions. It wasn't really a thick forest or anything, so it was sort of like a free-for-all for people walking. Sometimes people would just stand off the busy road while waiting for the bus to come by or something, not wanting to stand in all the traffic fumes while people sped by during rush hour. The only thing I took distinct note of was that I had been seeing him there a few times that week, and I had never seen him before previously. Oh well though, maybe he was a new college student, or just moved into the area or something. This time, walking on that shortcut felt different though, possibly because there was no one else on the path with me today. I started to get this bad feeling in my stomach. Something was not right. I was already well along into the shortcut though. I decided to blame my feelings on just being paranoid. Not like I could do much about it at this point anyway. I kept an eye on the man as I walked past. He continued to talk on his cell phone and didn't seem suspicious in any way. I continued to go on and thought it must be nothing. I must have walked about 30 meters away when the man suddenly stopped talking on his phone. I got an even bigger feeling of dread in my gut. I turned around to see him crouched over, phone gone, fidgeting around with some sort of cloth and a brown glass bottle. Before I even had a second to register what the fuck this man was doing, his head shot up in my direction. The look on his eyes was a terrifying mix between "I've been caught" and "I can't stop now." He dropped everything, leaving his shit behind, and started sprinting right for me, cloth in his hand. At this point, I was too far away from the busy road for anyone to see me with this crazy fuck, and I was too far away to scream bloody murder either. My first instinct in that split second was to run towards my neighborhood. I decided this all as I turned around, throwing my heavy backpack on the ground and sprinting as fast as I could, starting up the hill towards my neighborhood. Judging solely by appearance, this guy looked like he could break me in half with no effort. I trusted my flight response much more than fight in this moment. Plus, I didn't know what the fuck that could be in his hand. All throughout school, I had been top cross-country and track runner out of the female and male teams. My running had been my savior in a few other occasions, but soon into the chase, I knew it wasn't going to be enough this time. This guy was fast as shit. I could tell he was gaining on me without even having to look back. I finally saw some fenced-in yards up ahead and was hoping some people were home from work. I started trying to scream as much as I could with my out-of-breath and useless voice. I made the split decision to start jumping fences into people's yards, hoping this guy's hurdling skills were much crappier than his running. It seemed like the first fence threw him off a bit, but by the second into the next yard he was right on my ass. I felt like he'd almost grabbed my leg. I was shitting myself at this point. No cars in driveways, no sign of anyone home. The only thing keeping me from panicking and wiping out in my exhausted state was thinking I may never see my family or friends again. The next yard, though, belonged to people I knew rather well, including their dog. With that next yard and my newly acquired friend in sight, I had never felt as much hope as I did in that moment. By some insane stroke of luck, they'd let their dog out in the backyard for the afternoon while they were at work. When Leo, the dog, saw me frantically running towards him, he started wagging his tail. Immediately after, he looked at the guy chasing close behind me, and he started going crazy. I thought this would be enough to get the guy to get the fuck off of me, but no. He started to jump over the fence just after I did. The dog jumped up though, and his teeth sank into the guy's face as that creep fell backwards into the other yard, straight onto his ass. I fell into the dog's yard on mine as well. The creep and I stared at each other, out of breath for a few moments. The dog was barking and jumping like mad at the fence at him. Maybe he was assessing if he could take on Leo or not. I prayed the creep didn't have a knife or something. The guy looked angrier than I'd ever seen a person. After a few seconds, he got up and started running back down the hill from where we'd come. I sat there for a few seconds in complete shock. I couldn't move until my little hero started licking my face. I snapped out of it, ran to the back door, and started pounding. Obviously, they weren't home, or they would have probably heard what had just gone down. My house was close enough, thankfully, so I jumped the fence and ran the rest of the way home. Then I called the cops to investigate and try and find the guy. I gave them the best description I could after coming face to face with the man. The dude's bag was gone though, and so was every trace of them. They also found my poor knapsack in a muddy puddle, and the police told me they'd keep on looking. I never saw that guy again, and I didn't hear anything more about it. After calling the office a few more times, I gave up. They told me during that time they had received several sketchy reports. People being stalked, chased, nothing quite like mine though. Over the last few months, there were also a few missing persons cases. In a city like the one I'm from though, not the worst and not the best, you can never connect anything like that for sure. The more I thought about it over the years, the more fucked up it is, and the more confused I am. First of all, if he was trying to kidnap me, why didn't he think of a better way to grab and snatch into the forest before I had the chance to get away, or before another trail goer could have possibly walked by? He didn't appear to have a weapon or anything on him either, except for that creepy cloth. My friend thought it must have been chloroform. I did some research on it, and apparently it's more of a myth that pouring on a rag and covering a person's face causes them to faint quickly. It actually takes quite a long time. Plus, where the hell did he get it anyway? He didn't seem very prepared for his impromptu kidnapping. Thanks to that asshole though, I never walked that shortcut anymore, without at least 2 friends and some pepper spray or some sort of protection. So I work at a pizza place, usually inside, as my insurance does not cover claims when driving for business. Occasionally though, I'll cover a delivery shift for one of the drivers because the money is very good. Our delivery area includes a few new development upper middle class cookie cutter neighborhoods, usually bad tips. An older 1940s era village, average tips. 2 apartment complexes where you get great tips, and some trailer parks where you might get no tips. There's also a few rural areas. Not rural or anything to the point where you could see all the stars at night, but enough that you couldn't hear your neighbors yelling or anything. About a week ago, I was covering a delivery shift. I come back to the shop feeling pretty good. I was averaging $5 a delivery, and they'd all been pretty close by. I checked to see if I had any more on the list. I had one to this address I had never seen before. We usually only got semi-regulars as deliveries, so an address that I wasn't the least bit familiar with was quite odd. It was out on one of the more rural roads. I asked the kid who'd taken the order what was up, because there were special instructions on the ticket as well. They said to go around back because the front door doesn't work. Okay, that's not that uncommon, I suppose. People often want you to go around back. Either they just painted the door, or the house is shifted and it's a bitch to open or something. Maybe they're just hanging out back with their friends. As I'm driving out to the house, though, I started to get an odd feeling. I didn't really like the idea of going to the back of some house way out here in the sticks. It would be all too easy for some thugs to order a pizza to an abandoned house and then jump the delivery guy. There were quite a few in the more rural areas. I figured I'd just scope the place out when I got there, and if it seemed sketchy, I'd just call them and make up some bull about how it was against company policy to go around the back of houses to prevent robberies. As I was driving further, I realized it was toward the end of this road that got less and less populated the further down you went. Great. I was getting pretty near the address now, driving slower. All of a sudden, I see this house, completely abandoned looking, set back from the roads with no address on it, in the middle of a bunch of trees. I think to myself, that better not be the fucking house. I drove past and checked the next house's address. Lo and behold, that abandoned-looking house was the right one. Shit. At this point, I was not super worried though. Out in the boonies, the standards of upkeep on your house are pretty low, so a house in disrepair isn't that unusual. I double back over to this house and pull into the driveway. I was getting really bad vibes. Something was not right here. I parked my car at the very end of the driveway, with the rear on the shoulder so anyone passing by could clearly see it. At this point, I called back to the shop and told them this was quite sketchy. If I didn't call back in 4 or 5 minutes, call me, and if I didn't answer, call the cops right away. While I was calling in, I took a chance to take a better look at the house. It looked extremely abandoned, not just in disrepair. The driveway was crumbling, bits of gravel and weeds were growing out of it. There was no mailbox either. No trash cans, no car, no lawnmowers, no landscaping. Absolutely nothing to indicate anyone lived here. It looked like the yard hadn't been mowed in years, almost like a jungle. The house was total crap as well. The roof was falling apart, the siding was falling apart, the back deck which came around the side was falling apart too. The only part of the house, in fact, that looked even a little bit decent was the allegedly non-functioning front door. The windows were all completely shut. Well, the few that weren't boarded up at least. I didn't see any wires running to this house either. It was not dark, but it was dusk. Not a single sign of light in the house. I was getting pretty nervous at this point. I'm a 5'10" male, 180 pounds. Not in particularly great shape, but I did take karate for 10 years. I'm not completely helpless, but I avoid any sort of fights if I can. I'm mostly a pacifist anyway. I would rather not get robbed, but I was mostly worried about getting jumped and killed. It was a fairly safe area, but recently there had been some unsavory people moving in from the city. A big spike in home invasions and robberies. More worrying, a few stabbings and assaults as well. Now it was either time to nut up or shut up. I was not going to just go charging in there like a fool though. I got out my phone and called the number they'd given when ordering. While doing so, I got the pizza out as well, and made sure to leave my door open. A running car half in the road and an abandoned house with the door open looked suspicious, right? I figured if any shit went down, it might look out of place enough to make someone stop. Not that there's any real traffic this far down this road. I was starting to walk up to the house while the phone was ringing. Rings twice, then an automated message comes on. It said something along the lines that this phone number was associated with an internet texting app. I think Haywire, perhaps. This was a huge red flag. My heart was pounding in my throat. Everything was telling me to bail. I didn't want to get a reputation for being a flaky bitch-ass driver though and lose all future delivery shifts, which is why I had not bailed yet. I'm just standing there holding this pizza, looking at this haunted house or whatever, not wanting to venture around the back of it. I was hoping the resident would just look out the window and come out by the road to grab it. I'm looking at the front windows, checking for any sign of life. I see a blind go up on one of the windows next to the front door, and this really creepy guy, hat pulled low and big sunglasses, looking out at me. There was no reason for him to be wearing sunglasses when it was this dark. There also appeared to be a giant guy standing behind him in the room. It could have been anything, I suppose. When he saw me looking, he mouthed something and darted away, presumably toward the allegedly broken front door. At this point, I noped the fuck out. I had stayed pretty close to my car anyway, so it was only a few steps away. I jumped into the driver's seat, threw the pizza into the passengers, something I would never do since I'm really anal about keeping my car clean, and slammed it in reverse. Without looking, I simultaneously slammed and locked my door, floored it backwards onto the main road, and slipped my clutch horribly. At this point, I didn't care though. I didn't want to fuck around and risk a stall. I didn't even check for cross traffic. Really stupid on my part, I know. I started to drive away and looked back at the house. The screen door on the outside of the front door was now open, but the front was shut still. The guy wasn't out in the yard yelling, "Wait, come back," or anything like that. It seemed he had just disappeared. I pulled over a little ways up the road to call back to the shop and tell them I was all good. I'd elaborate fully when I got back. Those people never called back to inquire about their food or anything. Usually people would call if their pizza was just 15 minutes late, and these people never even got it. It was really strange they never said anything. Pretty much confirmed they were up to no good in my mind. After telling my coworkers about it, we concluded it was definitely a robbery at the very least. We put the address and phone number on our no deliveries list and ate their pizza ourselves. I doubt I would have gotten murdered or anything. Maybe robbed with a gun pulled out or a little roughing up, sure. It was still unnerving though. I could have easily gotten into some serious trouble just by doing my job, especially if those idiots had picked a slightly less abandoned house to set up at. This happened in my hometown when I was 7. I'm 36 now. For context, I lived on an island just off the coast of Washington State, in a military town that's among one of the safest places to live in all of the US. Still though, I suppose weirdos are everywhere. Timing is vague for me, but since I was outside playing with my friends, I guess it was likely a summer evening just before dinner time. We were screwing around riding our bikes in the street, running around and doing the usual kid stuff, when a car pulled up and stopped right across the middle of the street. I don't remember exactly what the man driving it said, but he must have beckoned me over, because next thing I know, I had walked close enough to hear more. The man asked me if I had seen other kids wandering around this place, because his kids were missing. I noticed that there was also a woman in the car with him. I assumed she must be the mom if he was the dad. I told him I hadn't seen them wandering around, but there was a park nearby around the corner, and he might be able to find them there. The man asked if I would be willing to get in his car and show them where this park was. Although I didn't understand just how dangerous this was, I was well aware of the whole stranger danger thing, so of course I said no. The man asked again if I would please get in the car and help him find his children at this park. I told him no once more. I couldn't do that. I did give him directions though, and skipped off to continue playing with my friends, who were standing there watching the whole time. The man just drove away. A few minutes later, my mom came outside to call me in for dinner. I bounced happily up the driveway to tell her I'd just helped someone out. I was very proud and excited to have helped out an adult. I explained the whole situation to her. I could see her face change, but she just nervously said, "That's very nice of you, hun." I felt a surge of pride within me. When my dad came home, my mom obviously told him what had happened. His reaction was much different. He told me although he was proud I liked to help people, I was never ever to approach anyone I didn't know like that again. Adults should never be asking children for help. He told me I was very lucky I hadn't gotten snatched, and to always remember it, because they would have lost me forever if things had gone badly. He was very stern, which did hurt my ego a bit, and I lost a tiny bit of innocence that day. So this happened just before my 20th birthday, when I was in the United States Navy. I was stationed at a naval school in South Carolina for pretty much the entirety of my enlistment, close to Charleston, but not actually in the city. It wasn't uncommon for us with cars to drive down into the city, and everyone was friends with someone with a car. Me and my class leader, who was 22, we'll call him P, were awfully close. He was also friends with this 19-year-old New Yorker that I didn't like too much. We'll call him T. T had a car though, so we ended up having to stick together quite a lot. One night, after all three of us had tanked a very important test, I convinced them to go for some ice cream to cheer up. We decided to go to this little mom-and-pop style shop on the far side of Charleston, and we all piled into T's truck. After we had grabbed our ice cream, P went to start giving T directions, since he couldn't find his way out of a damn shoebox. T, though, insisted he knew this special shortcut, and all we needed to do was just enjoy the ride. It wasn't like we had anything early the next day anyway, so I figured, why the fuck not? It'll probably just be a funny story later when T inevitably gets us all lost. So there we are, driving for at least twice as long as it should have taken to get back to base, but T keeps on promising that we're almost there. Meanwhile, we hadn't seen a single building in 10 miles. The road was so dark, it was almost like looking out into the abyss. At this point, T casually mentions that he has to pee, so P and I tell him to just pull over, take a leak real fast, and do his business. The road was lined with forest anyway, so he had plenty of options to save his dignity. For some reason, though, he insisted on pulling all the way off-road. T finds this random dirt road and turns down it. P and I both glance at each other and say that he needs to stop right now. We were both from the South, while T had grown up mostly in New York. We both knew how real shoot first and ask questions later could be out this deep. T, though, kept saying he was just gonna go a little bit further through the trees. At this point, all I could think about was how we're all going to get shot just because I wanted to get some ice cream, when we broke through the tree line. About 20 yards in front of us was a big bonfire, so bright compared to the light from the new moon. Immediately, my stomach dropped. P and I both started yelling at T to turn around right now. And that's when we noticed that the figures around the fire had now turned and were glancing at us. They started to close in. T was like frozen in the driver's seat, so I reached into the front and put the car in reverse, hitting him repeatedly in the shoulder. T turned around to check behind him and make sure the way was clear, only for him to freeze up once again. I turned around too, and saw even more figures closing down on the trail behind us. P, by now, had pulled out a flashlight and was trying to blind the figures, repeatedly telling T to go right now. We needed to get out of here. Slowly, he started to make his way back, while P was flipping his flashlight around in the highest setting. I was making sure all the doors were locked, and rolling up all the windows as well. I even closed the back sliding window. As we backed up, the crowd slowly parted around us, like we were Moses and they were the Red Sea. We made it back onto the road without any further problems, thankfully. We made the rest of the ride in almost complete silence, and the three of us never spoke about it since that day. The only thing that was said on the ride home was when P turned to me and whispered that all of those people were wearing masks. So, this story is going to be partially from my perspective as well as from my brother's to get the full story. It happened just last night while I was at my grandma's house. Before this all took place, I went to get McDonald's in the city nearest to us, which is about 20 minutes away. After that, I decided to go down to my grandma's house instead of going straight home. For some context, she lived down a long farm road, which you also had to turn off down a half-mile dirt driveway to get to her house. I arrived there at around 9 p.m., and I went in and visited with my grandmother and my brother. My brother lived there with her ever since my grandpa had passed away. We didn't want her to have to live all that far out all alone. My brother and I took out my grandma's dog to go to the bathroom at around 10:30 and just sat outside together listening to music and talking. At that point, it was starting to get a bit cold. This was East Texas. I was not quite used to it getting down to the low 40s at night, so I was just about ready to head inside. All of a sudden, though, I noticed something moving out of the corner of my eye near the large metal shop that sat a few hundred yards from the house. I didn't really take too much notice, though. It wasn't too uncommon for deer or raccoons to come snooping around in the yard at night. Plus, my grandma's dog wasn't barking or anything. Maybe it was even my eyes playing tricks on me so late at night. We finally headed back inside, and my grandma went to sleep at around 11 p.m. My brother and I stayed up and played some Among Us and watched YouTube for a while. At around 2:30 a.m., I was finally tired and ready to go home, so I asked my brother to walk with me to the door and make sure I got out to my car all right. I was always pretty paranoid, especially at night. He joked around and said he would turn the light off on me and lock the door. I freaked out and begged him to walk me out to the car, to which he finally humored me. I hopped in my car, locked all the doors, and saw the porch lights turn off as I was driving back down the dirt road. I'd gotten home within 10 minutes and fixed myself some ice cream before I sat down. I started watching some creepy horror stories on YouTube. After about 15 minutes or so, though, I got a FaceTime call from my brother, which I picked up right away. This was quite unusual. I could tell right away he was freaked out about something. He wasn't saying anything at first, though, so I asked him what was wrong. He told me that just after I'd left, he went back outside to continue listening to music and enjoy the sitting on the porch. He had the music on his phone up pretty loud, which would usually mask any noises of animals coming from the nearby woods. After a few minutes of listening, though, he heard what sounded like metal banging around, so he paused the music and listened to see if he could hear a little bit better. He stood up and looked toward the shop and boat shed, which were adjacent to each other. He could see a faint light shining around the boat bed. Then it quickly flicked off. At this point, he was freaking out, so he quietly crept back inside the house and locked the door behind him. I guess he didn't think to wake our grandma. He just ran and grabbed his revolver instead. He ran back outside, only to see the glow of a flashlight moving around, then shutting off immediately as he'd noticed it. He walked out to the edge of the concrete carport and stared out toward the boat shed with his revolver by his side. The only thing illuminating the boat shed now was the faint light coming from the house. He tried his best to muster up the most intimidating voice he could manage and called out into the night, "Who the hell is out there?" There was no immediate reply. Instead, there was a slight bumping sound, which solidified the fact that someone was indeed out there in the darkness. Keep in mind, this was out in the middle of country, in a town with a population of just over 1,000. The nearest house was all the way across the lake, or miles and miles down that farm road. No well-meaning person would just happen to stumble across my grandma's house this late at night. There had also been many times recently where people had been snooping around my grandma's property, so this was not something we could take lightly. For the life of me, I can't tell you why my brother didn't just call the police. You have to remember, I guess, that there's literally only one cop for our entire town, and it was 3 a.m. as well. It would take at least an hour for him to even show up. My brother again called out for the person to show themselves and repeated his question. He said that he practically shit his pants as a tall, lanky figure slowly emerged from the boat shed with a flashlight in hand. Although my brother couldn't see any distinct features about this person, he could definitely tell it was an older man, and it was not someone from the town. It was especially not someone that should be in our boat shed at 3 a.m. At this point, he raised the revolver up to point at the man and shouted again, "Who the fuck are you?" The man was silent once more and began to walk menacingly toward him. My brother pulled back the hammer of the revolver and gave one last verbal warning to the man. "I swear I'll blow your fucking head off. Tell me who you are and why you're here." The man raised his hands up and said in a mocking voice, Whoa, calm down, man." He continued to walk toward my brother. My brother fired a single shot just beside the man, to which he finally took that as his cue my brother was serious. The man hurriedly took off on foot back down the driveway, and my brother screamed, "Next time, I won't miss." My brother ran inside to wake up my grandma, who had somehow slept through the entire commotion, including the gunshot. She didn't seem worried enough to actually call the police, but of course, after hearing this, all I could think was, what were the true intentions of that man? Just a meth head snooping around to steal some tools for drug money? Or something more sinister? Another question that haunts me about this whole situation is how many times had this happened after my grandma and brother went to bed and we just hadn't known? Was he watching me as I walked out to my car? What would have happened if my brother had actually turned out the lights, locked the door, and not walked me to my car? This happened to me when I was going to school in Los Angeles in the spring of 2012. I grew up in Indiana in a very safe community, so it took quite a while for me to adjust to the craziness and crime of the city, although this incident really changed my behavior forever. At the time, I was living in an apartment with 4 other women at my college. Our place was right above a house, so to access it you had to go along an alley right next to it, up some stairs and out of the way pretty much. This one day, I was running home real quick to grab some music before choir, and was putting my music together on the kitchen table. I didn't bother to lock the door, since I was only going to be there for a few minutes. All of a sudden, there was a knock on the screen door. I looked up, only to see a man standing there, looking in. I called out something like hello, thinking the man must be here to deliver a package or something. That's basically the only kind of traffic we'd ever get up to our apartment door. The man didn't say anything. Instead, he reached down and twisted open the screen door, which I just remembered was still unlocked. The man was a medium-height, youngish Hispanic man in a t-shirt and jeans. Basically looked just like any guy you'd see all over LA. He still didn't say a word. He walked over to me at the kitchen table. I was a little bit alarmed, starting to say he could just leave his package on the table, when I noticed he did not have a package. The only thing in his hand was a small plastic container, which as I was watching, he flicked out the blade of a box knife. At this point, he reached my seat and put the blade up against my neck. I finally realized this man was not here for a package. He was here to hurt me. With the blade held firmly against my neck, he told me to get up and walked me into the bedroom next to the kitchen, which was my roommate's. He turned and locked the bedroom door and threw me to the bed, all while holding the knife against my throat. My mind was racing. I tried to tell myself that he probably just wanted to rob us, and I just let him take whatever he wanted. As I was sitting on the bed, he started looking around and grabbed some phone cables next to it. He began trying to tie my wrists with them. It was not working very well, but he kept on trying. I realized that if he succeeded, this would become a lot scarier for me. I distinctly remember in that moment deciding I'd rather be stabbed by a 1-inch box knife than be raped or worse. I screamed, pushed him away, and sprinted for the door. The man caught me and threw me down, and again tried to tie my hands with the cords. I was screaming for real now, though, and began smacking at his head with my hands. After a few moments of this, he decided to bail instead. He sprinted out the front door and out of my apartment. I followed the man, screaming for help to the alley behind the house. One of the people who lived in the house underneath our apartment came out within seconds and saw the guy running down the alley. He chased him out into the street. We called the cops together and they came super quickly and took my statement multiple times. We actually went down to the station, where I worked with a police artist on a drawing that they posted on TV. They caught that guy within the same week, and I believe he went to jail for several years. The local police officer who responded to the scene said a local gang required new members to bring the nipples of a white woman when they wanted to join. That was his guess of what this guy wanted. Now, I always tell people to lock their doors no matter how quickly they'll be leaving or how safe they feel. People are always looking for easy opportunities to take advantage, even of a split second. First off, I suppose I'll give some backstory. When I was younger, I worked for my lake community during the summer season, for about as long as I can remember. The jobs ranged from anything from dishwasher, maintenance worker, boat tender. My last job, and the longest one, was beach security. The lake had this small beach with a building that had a game room, a deck overlooking the beach, a restaurant, a small motel, and a lobby for guests of the hotel and restaurant. I was assigned to check in the guests of the beach and make sure they were members in good standing, who paid their community dues as well. I also had to enforce the rules beset upon the whole area. As you can imagine, I would get quite a lot of flack at this job from Karens, crusty teens, and other idiots who were up there for the summer. It came with almost as much drama as you might see on a CW teen drama show. This story took place during the summer and fall of 2011. I had graduated college at this point, and promised myself this would be my last year of doing this work. I was so tired of the drama, and I was ready to find a real job now. To bank some more money this year, I also took the position of doing night duty on beach security. For this, I would monitor the property for 3 more hours after the game room and restaurant closed at 11 p.m. and make sure nobody was trespassing during the night. This mostly meant I just walk the property, stay in the lobby area, watch some TV, and play my Nintendo DS until my shift was over. 98% of the time, it would come and go by real fast, but sometimes I'd see the occasional deer, raccoon, fox, or black bear walking on the deck. I would also have to occasionally ask people to leave or call community security for assistance. I was an unarmed security guard, and I didn't have any weapons or anything for self-defense at the time of the story. One night in July, I was watching Adult Swim on the TV, with a sliding glass door behind me that led to the deck. The show that I was watching went to commercial break, and the screen went black. As this happened, I noticed in the reflection of the TV screen, someone appeared to be standing on the deck behind me, looking into the door at me. Immediately, I jolted up and turned to this figure. I just stared at him. There was a 5'8" man wearing a dirty black hoodie with a white Adidas logo on it, navy blue basketball shorts, and white sneakers. He had his hood up all the way, and I couldn't make out his face at all. I could tell he appeared to have red dyed hair underneath his hood though, and seemed to be a bit younger than I was. He was just standing there, swaying back and forth with his hands in his pockets. He was staring at me, but it was almost like he was looking through me. I took a second to collect myself, then I walked to the glass door and talked through it. Hello, sir. I'm sorry, but the beach and deck are closed for the night. I'll have to ask you to leave the property and come back when we're open in the morning.
And when would that be?
He was very monotone and seemed tired and jittery. That would be at about 8 o'clock, I believe.
Okay, well, can I come in and use the bathroom for a moment?
At this point, I felt something much more off about this guy. I had dealt with drunks and people being super high, but this guy seemed to be on something else that I didn't want any part of. I'm sorry, but no one's allowed in here unless they're a guest of the hotel or restaurant, which are both closed for the night. If you could, sir, please vacate the beach. He seemed a bit annoyed in his voice, but his body language barely changed.
Fine, I guess I'll go somewhere else.
He then walked off. I made it a point to follow him off the deck and watch him walk away to make sure he left. Instead of heading up the road, though, he veered off into the woods. He was out of sight, but I could hear him dragging his feet through the brush and sticks. After that, I walked back into the lobby and locked the door behind me. I called dispatch and reported the incident and asked them to keep an eye out for this guy. 2 o'clock swiftly came by, and I locked everything up. I armed the security system and left. I started to drive out of the beach area. As I started to turn left, a balloon full of red liquid flew from the woods and slammed against my passenger side window. I got startled and floored it out of there. I wasn't going to get out and see what had just happened. I only lived 5 minutes away anyway. I got home and checked the damage. My passenger door was covered in red paintball paint. The impact had been enough to actually put a dent in it. I called this in and asked them to keep their eyes out and check the area for suspicious persons. The next day, I was told they hadn't seen anybody there, but I did get reports of the same thing happening to other residents' cars and houses throughout the night. I was pissed off and also unnerved that this had happened in the first place. Time passed by though, and now it was fall. The beach had closed for the season, but they still needed a night guard to make sure no one vandalized the property. It was the week of Halloween, and it was also my last night there. I'd gotten a job working at a much better place with better pay. I had also put in my last 2 weeks' notice. I went to a Halloween party during the day and went out as Jason Voorhees with a machete from Walmart as well. I was wrapping up for the night, sitting outside my car and talking my friend's ear off on my cell phone. As I was talking, though, I began to hear leaves rustling and twigs snapping in the woods behind the dumpster. I told my friend I had to go and hung up. I guess this was my dumb white person in a horror movie moment, because I walked slightly closer to where the noise was coming from. It was dark, but slightly lit from the parking lot's lights. As I was looking, from behind the dumpster emerged that very same guy I'd seen in July. His hood was down still, and I could see his hair had grown much longer. He began to swiftly walk up to me, growling, his face plastered with rage. He had a black iron pipe in his right hand and swung it as he came at me. He covered a lot of ground quickly. I dodged and ran to my car. I threw open my back passenger side door I was facing and grabbed the machete. I raised it over my head and stood my ground as bravely as I could. I don't remember what I said to the man. I was filled with so much adrenaline I was throwing out curses non-stop. The man seemed to stop and gauge our positions. I yelled and shook the machete a bit more. He simply turned around and disappeared back into the woods where he'd come from. As soon as he cleared the dumpster, I got the hell out of there. I was going way too fast for the winding roads my community had. I called not only security, but the police as well. Of course, by the time they got there, he was nowhere to be seen yet again. 4 years later, I moved away from my community and hadn't heard anything new about the man or anything related to the incident either. I now carry a knife on me at all times, and I still have that same lucky machete in my car, just in case. My family is from a small southern town. They've always lived around here, and in the early 70s, it was the kind of place where everyone knew all their neighbors. My grandpa owned his own grocery store. It was called Bill's Food Center. Everyone in town would come by regularly and grab their groceries, even stay and chat a while with us for a little bit. My mom had worked the cash register regularly from her early teens on, so she knew all the regulars and could always tell when someone hadn't been there before. This meant that when 2 men came in that she'd never seen in town before, she made sure to welcome them and asked if they needed any help finding anything. She told me she remembered being very unnerved by them from the very beginning. She repeated herself and asked if they needed any help. The older one replied, "Nah, sweetie, we'll let you know when we find what we need." As they checked out, the older man, who she described as mid to late 30s, kept asking her increasingly personal questions. She was polite, of course, but tried to give vague, general answers. The younger man that was with him was in his early 20s or so, and never spoke a word, always just followed what the other person said. After that, they started to come in every day, for about 4 days or so. They always unnerved her because they seemed to be looking after her specifically. She never felt too threatened or weirded out until the very last day they came in, though. The older man said he could use some help now, and explained that they were going on a camping trip and needed some help picking out some supplies. He said they needed some really strong rope and some duct tape as well. He explained he liked to shoot guns and needed the duct tape to wrap around his hands while shooting or something. Of course, she felt that explanation was odd, but it's not like she could stop him from buying things. She helped him pick out the supplies and check them out as well. She got such bad vibes from them that day that when they left, she made sure to memorize their license plate just in case. Only a few days later, a cashier at another local store down the street from my grandpa's suddenly went missing. After searching for a few days, the police found her body near a local river. She had been beaten, sexually abused, tortured, and stabbed repeatedly. She was bound with duct tape, barbed wire, and rope, the exact same items exactly that my mom had sold the two men. When she read about the murder in the Sunday paper, her stomach dropped. She immediately felt she knew the two men were responsible. She told my grandpa this as well. She knew those two men were somehow involved. Of course, my grandpa was skeptical at first, but my mom was so adamant he eventually caved in, and they went to the police together. My mom was questioned extensively by the lead detective. It took quite some time, but the police eventually caught up with those men, and they were found guilty of that murder. My mom was so shaken up about the whole thing, she refused to work in the store alone from then on. She was even more alarmed when the police informed her that the men had been casing my grandpa's store before ultimately deciding to take the other woman.